Could the US fight off an invasion of its homeland? That question has been burning a hole in the brains of Americans since before the Cold War began in 1945, and continues to do so even today. The United States military is currently one of the most well-equipped and advanced militaries on Earth. But would they be able to defend the country from a highly sophisticated and all-out assault? The US spent around $877 billion in 2022 on defense, so one would certainly hope that all those tax dollars are going to something useful. So, what would a potential invasion of the mainland United States look like? What factors would influence the outcome, and how would the US respond? First things first, has the US ever actually been invaded? Let's look at a few examples and see what the results were. After successfully fending off the British during the American Revolution, the US in the early 1800s was cruising. Everything was trending in the right direction, and the country was growing both physically and in a sense of national spirit. It takes some gumption to pull off the deal of the century in the Louisiana Purchase. 530 million acres for $15 million, which is about $358 million today, is still a preposterous deal. There are ranches in Montana for sale today worth about half of that, so $358 million for half a continent is just insane. Regardless, the brand new United States of America thought they were living in a relatively good era, having beaten the British and continuing to establish themselves on the world stage. The British, however, had other ideas in mind. They attacked US trading ships and forced captured American sailors into service in the Royal Navy. So the US declared war on Great Britain to defend its honor. The war lasted from 1812 to 1815 and actually resulted in the British attacking, burning, and occupying Washington, D.C. The British troops burned a large portion of the city, including the White House and the Capitol building. President James Madison and his government had already been evacuated, but this defeat still brought great shame upon the young nation. This was the only time in U.S. history that a foreign army had occupied the nation's capital. Peace was eventually negotiated, and no one really won the war, but the Americans would get the last laugh as Andrew Jackson and his force of backwoods farmers, pirates, frontiersmen, former slaves, and all-around ruffians defeated an experienced, tough, and numerically superior British force in about 30 minutes in the Battle of New Orleans. The next time that the United States was invaded occurred during the Mexican-American War. The event that actually triggered the war was when Mexican forces attacked U.S. soldiers patrolling the Rio Grande. The Mexican forces then invaded Brownsville, Texas, claiming they were taking back territory that rightfully belonged to Mexico. This event was known as the Thornton Affair and caused President Polk to declare war on Mexico. Although this invasion was incredibly brief, the war that came out of it saw U.S. troops conquer Mexico City and take control of parts of California, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming as a result. The next major conflict to take place on American soil was the Civil War, but we'll pass on that one, given the U.S. was fighting itself. The next time the U.S. was under threat of foreign invasion came again from its southern border with Mexico. In 1915, as war ravaged Europe, the United States watched from afar. All the while, Mexico was undergoing its own revolution. The Mexican government under Venustiano Carranza had been secretly supporting raids by bandits across the southern border of the United States that were violent and chaotic. President Woodrow Wilson supported Carranza and his government as a way of making the raids stop, but unbeknownst to him, Carranza was the one supporting the raids in the first place. So, as things got more complicated and the US got more involved south of the border, a man named Pancho Villa took things into his own hands. Villa was outraged at the United States' support of Carranza and decided to launch raids of his own. These raids culminated in an attack on Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. Villa led the attack himself, and the battles saw heavy fighting between Villa's forces and elements of the 13th Cavalry Regiment of the U.S. Army. Villa was eventually driven back into Mexico, but this incursion would trigger a U.S. invasion of Mexico to capture Villa. The U.S. defeated Villa's forces but failed to capture him. This would come to be known as the Pancho Villa Expedition, led by none other than John Blackjack Pershing, who would go on to greater fame in the latter years of World War I. Mexico would again be caught up in a possible invasion when the Germans in World War I tried to get Mexico to launch a large-scale invasion of the southern US if America entered the war against Germany. In return, they were promised some of their former territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Mexican government turned them down, but this communication got leaked and actually became one of the key justifications for the US joining the war. These examples have mostly been isolated incidents, not full-scale invasions with the aim of conquering and controlling the US, although some could argue that the British came the closest. In World War II, the world was again at war, and yet again the US tried not to get directly involved. That all changed on December 7, 1941, when sea and air forces from Imperial Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, as well as coordinated strikes on other US forces around the Pacific right after. As devastating as this attack was, it did not constitute an invasion, as the Japanese forces did not seek to conquer Hawaii, only inflict as much damage to US forces as they could. However, this attack was the most coordinated, sophisticated, and lethal attack on US soil to date, and served as the springboard for the US joining World War II. The Japanese did not stop there, however, and actually invaded the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. Although Alaska was not a state at the time, it was still a territory of the US and thus an invasion. Japanese forces occupied these two islands in June of 1942 and held them until August of 1943. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that a foreign army had truly invaded American soil, and the American public was furious. There was also rampant fear that the Japanese would launch an amphibious invasion of the west coast of the US, primarily in California. These fears were mostly unfounded, as the Japanese did not have the manpower or resources to do this. So, in response, the US and Canadian militaries launched attacks on the islands to reclaim them. The only real fighting occurred on Attu, as the Japanese had secretly withdrawn their forces from Kiska before the Allied attack. Attu was a bloody affair, as Japanese and Allied soldiers fought for every inch of ground in horrendous weather. With their backs to the sea, the Japanese commander Yasuo Yamasaki ordered a banzai charge with all of his remaining men. The charge caught the Allies by surprise and broke through to their rear echelon units. The Americans and Canadians recovered and through brutal hand-to-hand combat killed all but 28 of the Japanese soldiers on the island. With the Allies reclaiming the Aleutian Islands, they began turning up the heat on the Japanese Empire, and we all know how that one ended. On the other side of the map, and allied with the Japanese, you have Nazi Germany, whose insatiable conquests of Europe terrified the entire world. The American public thought that once Hitler finished off conquering the Old World, he would turn his sights toward the New World. Hitler did not believe the Americans were a formidable enemy, and even went as far to say that they had no real fighting strength because they had no racial purity. I'm sure he lived to regret that one when the Tuskegee Airmen began shooting down his vaunted Luftwaffe in droves. So while Hitler may have not thought of the Americans as a threat, he still wanted to conquer as much of the world as he could. His ambitions were mostly in his head, however, as no concrete plans for an invasion of America ever came to fruition. The German High Command recognized that an invasion of this scale was beyond their abilities and resources at the time. After World War II and into the Cold War, many Americans became paranoid about a Soviet invasion of the US. Thankfully, nothing ever materialized. That brings us to the present, where the world again finds itself in a dangerous situation. East and West are still at odds, always with weapons at the ready. If a foreign power, perhaps China or Russia, decided to launch a bold invasion of the US homeland, it would have to be highly sophisticated, coordinated, and move at terrifying speed. That is the only way it would work, requiring all the pieces to move in perfect synchronicity with each other. But in war, things hardly ever go according to plan. So what would a potential invasion look like? That is the question the generals in the Pentagon wrestle with, and even they can't say with absolute certainty how things would go down. Still, the consensus is that it would come in the form of a combined arms assault, with the bulk of the invasion being an amphibious landing. Given the US's air and sea power, the enemies would need to maintain control of the battlefield to even have a prayer of this going well. A relevant example can be seen in the invasion of Normandy, where the Allies were able to secure air and naval superiority, giving them the upper hand they needed to push the Germans back. Additionally, in the Pacific theater of World War II, all of the American island campaigns were amphibious landings. These landings would have likely been massacres if not for the supremacy of the US air and naval forces. In any case, where in the US would foreign invaders strike first? An amphibious assault against the US would most likely come from the West Coast, as the East Coast is more heavily defended given the many major military installations and shipyards spread over its length. Of course, the West Coast has a large military presence as well, so it's only a slightly better choice. Wherever they landed, enemy troops would seek to quickly capture as many deepwater ports as they could. The US beaches, by and large, are not consistently fortified against amphibious invasions, so if surprise is achieved, enemy forces could be rolling down Hollywood Boulevard before you could blink. The capture of ports such as Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, Tacoma, and Seattle would be absolutely crucial to maintaining a strong supply line as the invasion moved into the interior. That would be the first priority. Once the invaders could get supplies ashore, they would need to be able to move them. To do so, they would probably capture as many warehouses, armories, logistics, fuel, and railroad centers as they possibly can. Not only would this ensure supplies for their own armies, but it would deny resources for the US forces. It's possible for them to bring their own supply vehicles, but an amphibious invasion as daring as this would need to move quickly and not be over-encumbered with massive trucks, at least not in the first wave. Once a beachhead and base of supply are established, the troops could then move inland to take out strongholds and encircle large cities. As footholds are established, the great push into the interior would commence and would be a slugfest. Driving eastward would be a true challenge, but considerably easier than successfully landing an amphibious assault force. Once the tanks hit the highway of the Great Plains, who knows how far they could reach before they could be stopped. The goal here is absolute surprise, confusion, and fear. If the invading forces can achieve those things and establish a foothold before the US can adequately respond, then they might be in deep trouble. But let's be clear, this is an extremely optimistic view in which many factors would have to go the invaders' way for any hope of success. So let's look at what factors would deter the success of an invading force. First up is geography. The US has built-in moats around it. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans act as a natural defense barrier against any potential invaders. For centuries, these oceans have deterred would-be enemies from even thinking about invading, just due to the logistical challenges of getting that much men and material in place and across the water. Even today, launching amphibious invasions is a massive undertaking, even for advanced and wealthy nations, so the list of who could possibly pull this off is pretty small. As previously mentioned, the most likely spot for an invasion would come from the West Coast, as the East Coast is more heavily defended and the southern route through the Gulf of Mexico would have invading forces surrounded on three sides by American air and naval bases. Not to mention that this area of the country has the potential for devastating hurricanes half of the year. Not exactly ideal conditions for thousands of men sitting on boats. Ask the Mongols how that one turned out when they tried to invade Japan. Once inland, geography is still on the side of the defenders. The United States has everything from deserts to high mountain ranges to lowland swamps. This variety in terrain is an attacker's nightmare, as this will require a diverse set of equipment and skills to overcome each one. That being said, if the invading troops were to get a foothold in the mountains, getting them out would be very tough. However, if the invading troops outpace their supply lines at the wrong time of year, they could find themselves not prepared for the weather, and Mother Nature has no mercy. Desert warfare is extremely different from fighting in the alpine climate of the Rockies or down in the muggy, oppressive heat of the South. So if the Chinese or Russians wanted to take the US, they would need highly trained, conditioned, and well-supplied troops to be able to maintain their high-speed offensive. If they don't, they risk getting bogged down in a protracted war. Guerrilla forces have utilized terrain to their advantage since time immemorial, and it would be no different in the US. Have you ever driven through the backroads of West Virginia or the swamps of Louisiana? So as you can see, geography plays a massive role in the outcome of an invasion for both the attacker and the defender. Now we have to acknowledge that there are other ways into the US. What if the attackers don't attack either coast? If somehow Canada or Mexico agree to let invading forces use their border with the US, that could potentially cause major problems. Now, this might seem outlandish, but stranger things have happened. Mexico or Canada could be coerced or bribed into this, but if they did, it would surely end badly. Although a land invasion is a lot simpler and quicker than an amphibious one, supply would still be an issue. The Canadian or Mexican ports of supply would surely be the first targets for US air power and are well within striking distance. So again, the key issue to this whole thing is the ability to supply the invasion and maintain that supply. If the initial shock and awe didn't take out US air superiority, then the invading forces better be able to defend their supply depots. The US-Canadian border has a relatively low number of crossings fit for military vehicles, so the invasion would either be spread out or bottlenecked. If you look up the Highway of Death, you'll see how exactly the US deals with tightly grouped military vehicle columns. The border has somewhat low security but is still actively monitored and patrolled by US law enforcement. The US-Mexico border is much more highly controlled and regulated. People still get through illegally, but if thousands of troops began massing in either country, it's reasonable to assume that US intelligence would notice. The good news is that both Canada and Mexico are on good terms with the US, and all parties profit immensely from trade. That brings us to the next factor that can make or break an invasion: technology. Remember when we talked about secrecy being a key to this whole thing? For any invasion of the US, the invaders would have to be able to mass their troops and supplies and move them into position in absolute secrecy. Lucky for the US, they have satellite programs that are highly advanced and critical for national defense. They can be used to detect and track troop movement, which would give US intelligence plenty of advanced warning if foreign armies were amassing troops and military equipment. They even have something called the Defense Support Program, or DSP, operated by the US Space Force. These satellites are a vital early warning system for national defense, operating in 22,300-mile geosynchronous orbits. They can detect missile launches, space launches, and nuclear detonations. In addition to satellite technology, the US military also has tremendous resources when it comes to radar and drones as well. For example, the US Navy has its own system known as ROTHR, or Relocatable Over-the-Horizon Radar. It can cover all of Central America, the Caribbean, and a large part of South America. Any direction an enemy force approaches from, if the radar is operational, there's eyes on them. The US drone industry used the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as its test laboratory, greatly expanding its capabilities. The primary function has always been intelligence gathering and surveillance, and that function continues to grow with each passing year. This is all to say that the US intelligence and early warning capabilities are incredibly complex and cover all areas around the borders of the United States. For any invader to even have the faintest hope of success, they would need to play a little dirty. Let's look at our next factor: unorthodox methods of attack. Warfare is getting more complicated, no one can disagree with that. It used to consist of two groups stabbing each other with metal blades, and now countries fight proxy wars in remote corners of the globe to control the flow of resources to manufacturers and consumers, all while maintaining their status on the world stage. To fight these ever-changing battles, new weapons are required. One of the greatest dangers in the years to come will be cyber attacks. These attacks can cripple government and private computer systems, cut internet access, disable water and electrical plants, and even scramble GPS systems to massive vehicles like oil tankers. There are a million use cases, but according to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the main goal of cyber warfare is to weaken, disrupt, or destroy another nation. Deception in warfare is nothing new. In fact, it's one of the most critical aspects of it. The Allies would have been thrown back into the sea at Normandy if they hadn't employed a complicated deception against the Germans and convinced them the actual invasion was going to occur at a place called Pas de Calais up the coast. This deception stalled Hitler from committing his panzer reserves and allowed the Allies the time they needed to establish a beachhead and take the fight to the Germans. So if an invading army wanted to approach the United States in secret, they would surely have to employ some level of cyber attacks to give themselves a chance. Another unorthodox method of attack could come in the form of an EMP. This stands for electromagnetic pulse and is essentially a brief burst of electromagnetic energy. These have been weaponized and could be attached to missiles or other similar methods of delivery. Once detonated, these EMPs would overload and shut down the electrical grids, while also degrading or destroying all kinds of technology. This could include everything from cell phones to car engines to generators. An EMP is a quick and easy way to take an opponent's technological advantage and roll back the clock to before the Industrial Revolution. So while America was blind and deaf to the outside world, trying to figure out what happened, an invading army could use the chaos as the perfect opportunity to strike. Technology aside, another more practical method of softening up an area for invasion is good old-fashioned military sabotage. It's not a secret that US air and naval power are second to none. So if an invading force wanted to level the playing field, they would embed agents who would conduct coordinated strikes against US air and naval facilities in the hours before the invasion was to begin. Now, I know what you're thinking. Those facilities have extreme levels of security, and you are correct, but that doesn't mean they're impenetrable. Here's another example from Normandy. The French resistance was crucial to the success of the invasion. Without the efforts to sabotage German rail and communication networks, the whole offensive could have collapsed. Some level of military sabotage could be one of the deciding factors in the outcome of a potential invasion. As Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu once said, there is no greater danger than underestimating your opponent. In terms of battlefield tactics, it doesn't get more simple or tried and true than divide and conquer. In this modern era of proxy wars and cyber attacks, the weapons of war are changing all the time. With every new invention, there is a brief period when people use it for good and the overall betterment of the human race, but inevitably it becomes weaponized. As an example, the first flight was in 1903, and by 1911, planes were being used as weapons. In August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan from a heavy bomber plane. From the first flight to dropping bombs capable of decimating cities, it only took 42 years. It's no surprise that the internet, for all of its positives, has the potential to become a weapon. Spreading misinformation or outright propaganda can effectively divide a population and cause conflicts between family members and friends. A foreign power could weaponize the internet with the intent of sowing incredible amounts of division within the United States. A divided and weak country that doesn't know what to believe would be much easier to conquer than one that is united and strong. Now, all of this talk of sabotage and cyber attacks assumes that the invading force wants to subdue the US and conquer it to govern. What if their intentions are more malicious than that? What if they just want to burn it all down and govern the ashes? Biological warfare is a nightmare scenario for the world and hopefully never really happens. According to the WHO, biological and toxin weapons are either microorganisms like virus, bacteria, or fungi, or toxic substances produced by living organisms that are produced and released deliberately to cause disease and death in humans, animals, or plants. Weaponizing anthrax, the plague, or something similar would cause untold amounts of death and suffering to all of North America. Diseases don't care about borders. Let's hope no country is that evil to inflict this degree of suffering on their fellow man. Following this deadly progression, then you have nuclear weapons. If a foreign power truly has no regard for the consequences of its actions, then it could consider using nuclear arms as a method of clearing out resistance in the US. Again, all it would achieve would be governing decimated land and radiated bones. Not exactly ideal, but if someone wanted to do to the US what the Romans did to Carthage, this would be the most efficient way in today's technology. But perhaps the most important factor in all of this is the United States military itself. The US military is one of the most advanced, highly trained, and equipped militaries in the world, and can seriously throw its weight around when it feels like it. As it currently stands, there are over 750 US military bases around the world. The global presence of the US cannot be understated, but it also has between 450 to 500 bases or locations in the US itself. US air and naval power would be crucial in the opening stages of an amphibious invasion, so protecting those resources and keeping them ready to fight at any given moment is a high priority for US defense planners. With around 1.4 million active duty service members, the US is currently the third largest military in the world. Any invasion of the United States would have to deal with a large number of active duty troops in the country, as well as about 450,000 National Guard members who can be called up at any moment. A key factor would be how effectively the US could bring back troops from bases all over the world to fight to defend their homeland. In comparison, China has over 2 million active duty soldiers with many more in reserve. Russia has around 2.2 million service members with their numbers in constant fluctuation due to the ongoing fighting in Ukraine. The rising casualties have made the Russians conscript a lot of their citizens who otherwise would not be in the military. Their level of training, the equipment they carry, and their battlefield effectiveness vary greatly between the different units. In terms of a land battle on the numbers alone, this should be a pretty close fight where the US has the advantage with its navy. The US Navy is widely considered to be the best and most powerful in the world. Its mix of warships, submarines, and an intimidating carrier fleet make it a formidable opponent. The US Navy's global presence and the firepower it can bring to the fight are an incredible deterrent to would-be enemies. That's really bad news for anyone trying to stage, launch, and execute an amphibious invasion. As President Teddy Roosevelt once said, "A good navy is not a provocation to war, it is the surest guarantee of peace." In addition to the active duty and National Guard units, the US has an advantage that the other countries simply don't have. The citizens of the US are the most well-armed country in the world. It's estimated that there are around 390 million guns in the US currently. That's around 120 guns per 100 people. As I'm sure you're aware, everyone today has an opinion on gun ownership, and they are entitled to it, but in the event of a full-scale invasion by a foreign power, they might come in handy. It's almost a surefire thing that if given the chance, militias of well-armed US citizens could rise up and conduct guerrilla warfare operations against the invaders. Although it is unverified that Admiral Yamamoto of the Japanese Empire reportedly said, "We can never invade America, there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." While he may never have said this quote, it undoubtedly rings true. If we look at recent examples of combat for how each nation fared, we can get a rough idea of how this might play out. Let's start with the US. Having fought essentially continuous wars for over a century, the US military is a juggernaut of practical combat experience. The past 20 years alone have seen the US fight 2 wars, and although you can't say they won clear-cut victories in either one, the battlefield experience gained there for everyone from the generals at the Pentagon down to the riflemen guarding the street corner will serve the US going forward for decades to come. The weapons technology in those wars has been tested and refined through the high-stakes trial and error that is combat. It's no secret that the US is the premier weapons manufacturer in the world. After finally leaving Afghanistan in 2021, which was a disaster, the US military is going through a phase similar to what happened after Vietnam. It's downsizing and rearming. This level of experience stands in stark contrast to that of China. They have not fought an actual war since 1979 when they fought Vietnam over Vietnam's conflict with Cambodia. The war lasted about a month and saw no clear winner. So even if any of the men who fought in that war are still alive, it was 45 years ago as of 2024, and they would be a little on the older side. That means that all the enlisted men, junior officers, and a good amount of the senior officers have no actual combat experience. That is a major disadvantage for any army going into war. Until the bullets start flying, we have no idea how the Chinese military will actually react. The Russian military has fought multiple regional conflicts since the fall of the Soviet Union, most notably against Chechnya, Dagestan, and Georgia. Those were smaller in scale and against comparatively inferior forces. It wasn't until the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 that the Russian military had its mettle tested properly. And unless you've been hiding under a rock, you probably heard something of what's happening in Ukraine. During the first days of the invasion, Russia initially swept deep into the Ukrainian defenses, causing massive breakthroughs with their superior armor. The Ukrainians stood their ground, however, with a little help from Western weapons, and pushed the Russians back to a stalemate. Both sides have dug in, and the territorial gains are minimal now, but casualty figures keep climbing. The Russians continue to bombard Ukrainian cities, while Ukraine uses drones to target Russian ships and infrastructure. This is the largest and most destructive conflict Europe has seen since World War II, and as of the production of this video, it doesn't seem like it will end anytime soon. The Russian military has had some successes, but has also struggled more than most people would have guessed. Civil unrest due to conscription orders and the wars on popularity are making the Russian home front increasingly turbulent. Have the ghosts of 1917 returned? The parallels are too eerie to be dismissed. Stalemates, trench warfare, civil unrest, and an oppressive government that will do anything to remain in power. The only thing you're missing is a drunken and mystical holy man named Rasputin. Only time will tell if things go the same route as they did in 1917, but one thing is certain, a lot more blood will be spilled whichever way the chips fall. Of course, all of this is speculative, so no one can say with absolute certainty how an invasion of the United States would go. That's the thing about warfare. The victors usually do something bold or unexpected. As it stands, the US is one of the most secure countries on Earth. Its geographical advantages, such as two massive oceans on either side of it, insulate it from traditional ground invasions and make an amphibious invasion one of the few viable options available to would-be invaders. Amphibious invasions are incredibly hard to pull off successfully. Even with the technology we have at our disposal today, an invasion force still has to get their troops together in position and onto the beaches. As we learned with Normandy, surprise and deception play a large role in the outcome of such invasions. However, the Axis didn't have spy satellites or drones watching every move the Allies made. The role technology plays in warfare today cannot be understated and is growing at an unprecedented pace. For an invader to have a chance, they would have to disrupt or disable the US's intelligence and technological capabilities before they hit the beaches. If they can't keep the US in the dark, they will struggle mightily to fight off US air and naval power. That being said, there are a few options they have for softening up the landing zones and country beyond. Some are more malicious than others. Cyber attacks and EMPs can disable technology in the blink of an eye and cause mass chaos and confusion. Such a move would undoubtedly give the attackers a clear-cut advantage in reconnaissance, communications, and high-tech weapon systems. If they go another route, such as using biological warfare, social subversion, or even nuclear weapons, things can get real ugly real quick. Nothing pulls people together quicker than a crisis, though, and the appearance of a terrifying common enemy might be just enough to have Americans set aside their differences and take up arms together to defend their families and homes. It's this unity that will allow America to prosper in the face of conflict. And this perhaps reveals who is most likely to be able to destroy America: America itself. This quote from Abraham Lincoln has the same profound importance today as when it was first said. Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. It should be clear to everyone watching that any type of war between the world's top 3 militaries or an invasion of the US would end in unmitigated disaster and death for millions, possibly even billions. If you like this video, now watch why the US military has bases everywhere, or this other video you might like. Thanks for watching. On the list of countries that spend the most money on defense, the United States is at the top, to no surprise. But it's when you combine the next 9 countries' budgets together that the staggering power of the United States truly starts to come into view. Even if you add up all of the defense spending of the other 9 countries, it still comes to less than that of the United States by itself. With an annual budget of more than $900 billion, 2 million plus service members, and over 700 bases spread across the world, the United States is one bear that definitely shouldn't be poked. Pouring such huge amounts of money into defense is one of the reasons that the US is the sole superpower in the world today, currently unmatched and unchallenged in its supremacy, especially when it comes to military might. But what if another country like Russia or China or even a consolidation of those other top 9 somehow, for some reason, decided to try and take on the USA? Well, here's a few reasons why that would probably be the last mistake they ever made. Reason number 1. You know the US has a large ground force, but it's not just big, it's mind-blowingly huge. By the numbers, the US military includes just over 2 million military personnel and just under 800,000 civilians, making the 2.86 million member military slightly larger than the entire population of Chicago. Compare that to the UK military, which has just under 152,400 total personnel. But it's not just the size of the military, it's the speed with which they can be moved. The Netherlands Marine Corps boasts an exceptional deployment time where they're able to get troops anywhere in the world within 48 hours. But the Joint Army and Air Force-run U.S. Immediate Response Force, they can have troops deployed anywhere in the world within just 18 hours. Additionally, these U.S. ground forces are equipped with the best technology available. Let's start with the now iconic M1 Abrams main battle tank. In service since the 1980s, the M1 Abrams has undergone several upgrades to ensure it remains one of the most formidable tanks in the world. And that's precisely what this tank is. The current fleet numbers around 2,500, with thousands more in storage. In contrast, China has only manufactured around 1,200 of their top tank, the Type 99, over the last several decades. There isn't a single list of the best tanks in the world that doesn't mention this armored marvel, and one of the latest iterations of this tank, the SEP V3 variant, undoubtedly warrants a place right at the top. This tank is powered by a Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine engine, which offers 1,500 horsepower and boasts an M256 120mm smoothbore cannon, which allows it to fire advanced rounds with unparalleled accuracy. The SEP V3 also features a modular design that allows for easy upgrades and modifications, ensuring that it remains at the cutting edge of technology for years to come. But perhaps most importantly, the M1 Abrams isn't all talk. This impressive tank has a proven record of success on the battlefield, unlike the aforementioned Chinese Type 99 tank. Just look at the Gulf Wars, primarily taking place in Iraq and Kuwait. The Persian Gulf War was when the M1 Abrams was first tested in combat, and yet not a single tank was taken out by enemy forces. Talk about a grand entrance. The M1 Abrams was later deployed in Afghanistan during the war in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia during the Yemeni Civil War, and Ukraine during the Russian invasion. It's also been modified and exported to Australia, Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Poland, and Saudi Arabia, solidifying its reputation as one of the most reliable and effective tanks in the world. The M109 Paladin is another powerful vehicle that allows U.S. ground forces to be so dominant. Now, this vehicle might look like a tank at first glance, but it's actually a self-propelled howitzer designed for long-range artillery support. The self-propelled part comes from a 4-man crew inside the vehicle that chooses the targets and fires the howitzer without the need for external equipment. This means that the M109 Paladin can quickly respond to changing battlefield conditions and provide rapid and accurate fire support to ground troops. Due to how quickly its semi-automatic system fires away, and the sheer mobility of the vehicle, once an assault begins, it can hardly be stopped. The M109 had its combat debut in Vietnam. Since then, it's been used by several armies in multiple high-stakes conflicts, such as the Yom Kippur War in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, the Persian Gulf War in Iraq, Kuwait, and areas on Saudi Arabia's borders, and the Iraq War in, you'll never guess, Iraq. In each of these conflicts, the US was able to better understand and improve upon the design of the vehicle, experience that other countries such as the Chinese don't have with their own vehicles. Hang on for a second though. If you think the US ground forces vehicles are impressive, just wait until you see the kind of firepower the US ground troops wield directly. After all, they're the ones who often have to face the enemy up close and personal. One mainstay is the M240 machine gun. This formidable, belt-fed, gas-operated medium machine gun can be mounted on aircraft and vessels as well, capable of firing up to 950 rounds per minute. Doing the math, that's nearly 16 rounds per second. Compare that with the Russian PKM, which is able to fire only up to 800 rounds per minute, or just over 13 rounds a second. Therefore, it's easy to see how it can be effective against both personnel and light vehicles, making it a versatile choice for taking out any enemy. Its earliest uses were during the US invasion of Grenada, aka Operation Urgent Fury, and the invasion of Panama, or Operation Just Cause. If you're looking for something similar in firepower but more capable of being carried around by an individual soldier, look no further than the M249 Squad Automatic Weapon, or SAW. Though initially designed in Belgium, the US ended up manufacturing its own version of this powerful light machine gun. With this weapon, you could get a range up to 11,800 feet. You could also get a high rate of fire, typically around 800 rounds per minute. Given how reliable this weapon is, it shouldn't be surprising that it's been used all over the world, including Bosnia, Somalia, and Ukraine. And while machine guns often get the spotlight, this explosive asset is an indispensable part of any soldier's kit: the M67 Fragmentation Hand Grenade. The M67 is undoubtedly one of the deadliest tools wielded by the US ground forces. This grenade has one goal: to inflict maximum damage. The M67 has a lethal radius of about 16 feet but can cause casualties up to 50 feet away, while dispersing fragments as far as 750 feet. So, when the pin is pulled and the safety lever released, you better find cover fast. The reliability of this grenade is proven by its long time in the service, as it was introduced first in the 1960s. Though the sheer amount of devastation its ground forces can cause is reason enough to avoid any conflict with the US, we're just getting started. This is merely the first reason why you shouldn't mess with the US, and the next 9 are even more staggering. Reason number 2 takes us to the skies, where the strongest air force in the world awaits. The strongest in numbers, capability, and technology. Of course, the numbers are the most impressive part initially, as they give a quick insight into just how dominant the US is in the skies. If you look at the annual Global Firepower, or GFP ranking, which takes a by-the-numbers approach to ranking militaries around the world, you'll see nothing but number 1s across all Air Force categories. Number 1 in total fleet aircraft strength, with over 13,000 aircraft, including over 1,800 jets, about 900 attack-type aircraft, over 600 tanker aerial aircrafts, and a mind-boggling 5,700 helicopters. Not only that, the 13,000 aircraft is more than 3 times bigger than the second-place country, Russia, with only about 4,200 aircraft. And much like the ground forces, the technological quality of the US Air Force is truly something to behold. One example can be seen in the US's fleet of stealth aircraft, such as the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. The first F-22 Raptor took flight on September 7, 1997 in Marietta, Georgia, following 6 years of development. This kind of aircraft is something other countries such as Russia could only dream of. Russia's response to the F-22 was their Su-57, first seen 21 years later in 2018, but the aircraft has seen limited time in combat, including the recent war in Ukraine. It's currently doubted how comparable the aircraft really is to the F-22. Which, by contrast, this technological marvel is renowned for its advanced stealth technology, supercruise capability, unparalleled maneuverability, and integrated avionics, earning it the title of the most dominant airfighter in the world. The F-22 is designed not to just defeat current threats, but to also counter emerging threats well into the future. In other words, you don't want to mess with this fighter jet now or ever. The same can be said for the next jewel in the US Air Force's shiny crown, the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. This fighter jet is the most lethal, survivable, and connected fighter jet in the world, all characteristics that should make you want to avoid crossing paths with it at all costs. And this goes for both the air and the ground, since the F-35 is designed to excel in both air-to-air and air-to-ground combat. With its advanced stealth capabilities, integrated sensors, and unparalleled situational awareness, this aircraft is nothing short of a game-changer for the US, not to mention all the adversaries who dare to challenge it. So far, the F-35 has gotten the job done for multiple US military branches on several heated battlefields. It was used by the Marine Corps against Taliban targets in Afghanistan, by the US Air Force against Islamic State targets in northern Iraq, by the US Navy in the Indo-Pacific. Basically, it's been used everywhere and has proven its effectiveness time and again. Another aircraft that sends the same message is the B-2 Spirit. This heavy strategic bomber, also known as the stealth bomber, features low observable stealth technology that allows it to penetrate even the densest, most sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. Even when spotted, this bomber is exceptionally difficult to track, let alone strike down. This allows it to seamlessly carry out its mission, threatening the enemy's most valued and heavily defended targets. The B-2's combat debut took place back in 1999 in Serbia, formerly Yugoslavia, where it was responsible for destroying as many as 33% of all targets within the first 8 weeks of Operation Allied Force. Afterward, this bomber was deployed in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya. Incredibly, this aircraft at times made 30-hour flights from Missouri to its target and back without even a scratch. As these operations have proven, the B-2 bomber can go just about anywhere, destroy its enemies, and disappear before they can even react. But despite what its name suggests, bombing isn't all the stealth bomber is capable of. The US often sends in this aircraft to collect the necessary data, which the B-2 does at an incredible rate. And as we all know, knowledge is power, which makes this aircraft a menace to all US adversaries, no matter how you look at it. With the US ground and air forces as the first two reasons for steering clear of the US, you can probably guess what reason number 3 is, and it's just as, if not more daunting than the other two. That's right, the sheer size and might of the US Navy. The next piece of the puzzle makes one thing abundantly clear. Go against the US and you won't be safe anywhere, including the sea. Going off of numbers alone, you can get a great and menacing picture of just how powerful the US Navy is. It has over 470 total naval vessels, 11 aircraft carriers, which is nearly 4 times more than second-place China with 3, over 70 destroyers compared to number 2 again, China with 49, and over 60 submarines. All of this, as well as an impressive assortment of amphibious ships, cruisers, and other support vessels that make up the backbone of its fleet and allow the US Navy to reach every corner of the globe. Let's learn a bit more by taking a closer look at the aircraft carriers. As far as aircraft carriers go, no country comes even close to the US. So much so that the next second-ranked navy, China, only has 3 of these supercarriers. But again, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the sheer capability and power these aircraft carriers bring to the table. Each one is a floating city capable of carrying and launching dozens of aircraft, including fighter jets, reconnaissance planes, and helicopters. These carriers serve as a mobile airbase, allowing the US Navy to project air power anywhere in the world. Here are just some locations where the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers have been deployed so far. The Gulf of Sidra near Libya during the Freedom of Navigation exercise, the South Korean coast to provide security for the Olympic Games in Seoul, Southern Iraq during Operation Southern Watch, the Philippines during Operation Fiery Vigil, Somalia during Operation Restore Hope, the Persian Gulf during Operation Vigilant Sentinel, Bosnia and Herzegovina during Operation Decisive Endeavor, the Ionian Sea during Operation Allied Force, Indonesia during Operation Unified Assistance, and off the coast of Haiti during Operation Unified Response. When used in a combat scenario, these aircraft carriers are always deployed in so-called carrier strike groups. These battle groups usually consist of 1 aircraft carrier, at least 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer squadron with at least 2 destroyers or frigates, 1 carrier air wing of up to 70 aircraft, and 7,500 personnel in total. Carrier strike groups are virtually impenetrable, so the image of one of these groups sailing forward toward the target is enough to instill fear in any potential adversary. The US Navy maintains 9 carrier strike groups in total, 8 of which are based in the US, specifically California, Virginia, and Washington State. The US-based groups include Carrier Strike Groups 1, 3, and 9 based at the US Naval Base in San Diego in California, Carrier Strike Groups 2, 8, 10, and 12 based at the Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia, and Carrier Strike Group 11 based at the Naval Station Everett in Washington. The only non-US-based carrier strike group is number 5, which is based at the Fleet Activities Yokosuka base in Japan. Carrier Strike Group 12 is led by USS Gerald R. Ford, the latest addition to the US Navy's mighty aircraft carrier fleet. As of 2024, this vessel is the world's largest aircraft carrier and the largest warship ever constructed. This mammoth of a vessel cost almost $13 billion to build and nearly $5 billion to research and develop, also making it the most expensive warship ever built. It's estimated that the largest Chinese carrier cost around $7 billion to make. But what, you might be asking, did all of these billions of dollars bring to the US Navy? Simply, the most technologically advanced warship ever built, featuring cutting-edge innovations that set a new standard for naval engineering. This includes the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, or EMALS, which provides a more efficient, smooth, and reliable means of launching aircraft. Advanced Arresting Gear, or AAG, a state-of-the-art system designed to safely recover a wider variety of aircraft with reduced stress on airframes, and significant automation, reducing the crew size required for operation and maintenance. Finally, when discussing seagoing US technological marvels that prove that bigger is often better, we can't neglect the fleet of Ohio-class nuclear-powered submarines, aka the largest submarines ever built for the US Navy. These submarines single-handedly make the US a deadly threat to virtually any enemy at sea. How so? Well, for starters, they're incredibly stealthy. Basically, by the time the enemies spot them, it's already too late. Ohio-class submarines are also heavily armed, regardless of the model we're discussing. We're talking up to 20 Trident II missiles on the ballistic missile submarines and up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles on the guided missile submarines. The comparable Russian Bore-class submarines can only carry about 16. These armaments provide the US Navy with both a strategic nuclear deterrent and a formidable conventional strike capability. One wrong move and these submarines can make it rain. And we aren't even talking about the big, truly terrifying missiles. Well, not yet, anyway. All the submarines operated by the US Pacific Fleet are based at the Naval Base Kitsap in Washington, while the ones operated by the US Fleet Forces Command are stationed at the Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay in Georgia. But let's go back to the missiles, because missiles are reason number 4 you shouldn't mess with the US. The US boasts a massive stockpile of missiles, with intercontinental ballistic missiles the most devastating. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs for short, are any ballistic missiles with a range greater than 3,400 miles. However, the missiles the US wields have a far greater range than the bare minimum. That's up to 8,700 miles to be precise. That's how far the Minuteman III ICBM can travel. Do the math, and you'll see that this range means the US can strike virtually any target on the planet. Don't believe us? Here are the average distances between the US and other places in the world that are within range of the Minuteman III. 4,547 miles to Brazil, 4,763 miles to France, 5,461 miles to Bosnia and Herzegovina, 5,522 miles to Russia, 6,427 miles to North Korea, 6,820 miles to Egypt, 7,237 miles to China, 7,244 miles to Iran, 7,367 miles to the Central African Republic, and 8,436 miles to India. The US has about 400 of these capable missiles deployed in missile silos around Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, and Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The Minuteman missiles primarily serve as a nuclear deterrent, the land leg of the so-called nuclear triad, whose goal is to ensure a credible and formidable response capability in the event of a nuclear attack. Speaking of a nuclear attack, the whole of the US's nuclear capabilities are another reason one would be foolish to go against this superpower. As of 2024, the US has just over 5,000 nuclear weapons in its arsenal, with the previously mentioned ICBMs only a fraction of this fear-inducing arsenal. While Russia boasts a similar amount, the next closest country is China, which currently holds about 350 nukes. But it's when you look closer at what types of nukes they are and how they're deployed where things really start to get interesting. A significant part of this arsenal is air-based nuclear weapons, part of the US Air Force's Heavy Bomber Group, which are deployed via 50 or so B-52 Stratofortresses and 20 B-2 Spirits. A significant number of these bombs are deployed in Europe at 6 air bases in 5 NATO ally countries: the Kleine Brogel Air Base in Belgium, the Buchel Air Base in Germany, the Aviano and Getty Air Bases in Italy, the Volkel Air Base in the Netherlands, and the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. This deployment allows the US to provide a rapid response to any region, which makes the notion of even making a threat a near-suicide mission. And given that America has over 700 bases around the world compared with China, who currently only has one permanent, fully operational base, the US is uniquely positioned to have weapons on standby in every corner of the globe. Though nuclear bombs make for a compelling reason number 5 not to poke the bear, it's currently unlikely that they'll be used anytime soon, which is why the explosively dangerous non-nuclear bombs must be more closely examined. It's critical to understand why these bombs make up reason number 6 not to mess with the US. Remember earlier how we said no enemy of the US is safe on the ground, in the air, or at sea? Well, as it turns out, they aren't even safe underground. Just take the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, as an example. This behemoth 30,000-pound precision-guided bunker buster bomb is used by the US Air Force to destroy deeply buried targets, such as underground bunkers and tunnels. Although, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator was developed with one target in mind: weapons of mass destruction. No matter how well protected these weapons are, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator should be able to take them out. This particular weapon is often top of mind when debating a potential attack on deeply buried nuclear facilities in North Korea and Iran. Some Iran underground facilities are estimated to be around 200 feet underground, which is a depth the MOP can strike. That's also why the US is amping up the production of these bombs, with an ammunition plant in Oklahoma producing 3 times more of them monthly. Of course, we can't talk about the most powerful non-nuclear bombs in the US's arsenal without mentioning the weapon aptly named the mother of all bombs. But this bomb is far from nurturing. Here are a few specs to make its destructive power clearer. The GBU-43B Massive Ordnance Air Blast Bomb, or MOAB for short, is a 21,600-pound bomb designed to target large and entrenched military structures or to clear extensive minefields. It has a blast radius of up to 1 mile and a blast yield of 11 tons of TNT. Though this bomb can't penetrate the ground, it can destroy structures like caves and canyons, which made it highly effective in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you think these manned bomb drops are wild, wait until you hear about what the US can do with unmanned vehicles. This brings us to reason number 7 to avoid getting on the US's bad side. Drones. Another weapon that has proven highly efficient and convenient across multiple combat scenarios. In the beginning, drones, also known as unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs if you want to get technical, were almost used exclusively for surveillance. However, after the September 11th attacks, their role expanded dramatically to include targeted strikes against enemy combatants. This made them a crucial part of the US's offensive on the global war on terrorism in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the rest of the Middle East. As of 2024, the US operates one of the world's largest drone fleets, primarily consisting of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance or ISR, and direct attack models. All of the country's major services have invested in drone technology, with the total number of units surpassing 16,000. We won't look into all of the models represented within this impressive figure. For this video specifically, 3 drone designs are of interest to us. Number 1, the Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel. 20 to 30 of these impressive units have been built for the CIA, but most of their specs remain confidential. What is known, or at least speculated, is that these drones are primarily used for ISTAR and SIGINT missions. ISTAR stands for Intelligence, Surveillance, Target Acquisition, and Reconnaissance, while SIGINT is a shorthand for Signals Intelligence, an activity that involves collecting information from signals such as radio or radar for intelligence purposes. This high-speed, jet-powered stealth vehicle was first deployed in Afghanistan in 2007, followed by South Korea in 2009. In the attack drones department, the MQ-9 Reaper deserves a special mention. This UAV has an incredible range of approximately 1,000 nautical miles and an operational altitude of 25,000 feet, which allows it to conduct long-term loitering operations. The MQ-9 can be armed with a variety of weaponry, including laser-guided bombs and Hellfire missiles. Even when fully armed, this drone can fly for some 23 hours, gathering intelligence and carrying out precision strikes if needed. Many experts believe that drones are the future of all warfare, which is why the US is heavily investing in new drone technology. One of its latest developments is the Boeing MQ-25 Stingray drone, which is likely to become operational sometime in 2026. The MQ-25 is a revolutionary product, the first unmanned aircraft to refuel another aircraft. For now, the unit is still being tested and developed at the Naval Air Station Point Mugu at Naval Base Ventura County. But if all goes to plan, this innovative drone will change the game, allowing fighter jets, bombers, and other aircraft to stay in the air longer without the need to land for refueling. While there's no denying that unmanned systems have revolutionized modern warfare, no machine can match the flexibility and creative problem-solving of our next reason. The 8th reason to avoid messing with the US? Its soldiers. The US might not be the nation with the most available manpower, active duty soldiers, or reservists. However, its forces are arguably the best trained and most disciplined in the world. They undergo rigorous training to develop not just their physical capabilities, but also their mental resilience and decision-making skills. This especially applies to the country's special forces, which are among the most elite and specialized units in the world. If we had to single out only one of these special forces, it would undoubtedly be the US Navy SEALs. Making up about 1% of all active duty members of the Navy, US Navy SEALs are widely considered to be the most elite and dangerous special operation force in the world. Known for their exceptional combat skills, physical fitness, and mental toughness, they're trained to operate in any environment, sea, air, and land, which is where their name, SEAL, comes from. And they're often called upon to undertake the most challenging and sensitive missions. SEAL training, known as Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL or BUDS training, is one of the most demanding military training programs in the world. It pushes candidates to their limits, both physically and mentally, with about 75% of candidates failing to complete the training. Of course, such a high attrition rate also guarantees that only the best will make it through. Though the entirety of this program is known for its demanding and intense nature, it doesn't get more grueling than the so-called Hell Week. During this 5.5-day stretch of continuous training, SEALs-to-be face intense physical and mental challenges, including cold water exposure and physical labor designed to push them to their limits. But once they get through the Hell Week and the entirety of the SEAL training, these soldiers become experienced warriors that few can match. Warriors you wouldn't want to face in any scenario. In fact, experience is precisely what sets the US military apart from most other countries contending for the title of a superpower. The US military is not just powerful on paper. It has also been battle-tested in numerous conflicts and operations around the world, honing its military capabilities and proving its effectiveness time and time again. You'll soon see how America's experience absolutely changes the game. This leads us to reason number 9, why you should stay off of the US's radar. The country's military knows precisely how to deal with almost any incoming threat. The US has experience in some of the world's more intense conflicts: Cold Wars, challenging insurgencies, impossible odds. From World War II to the Korean War, the Vietnam War to the Gulf War, and more recently, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US military has demonstrated its ability to adapt, innovate, and prevail in diverse and complex conflicts. Proof of the US looking to foster this mentality can be seen in the establishment of advanced training centers, such as the Joint Readiness Training Center, or JRTC, and the National Training Center, the NTC. This wealth of experience has not only shaped the US military's tactics, strategies, and doctrine, but has also cultivated a deep reservoir of knowledge and expertise among its personnel. In 2022, the US Census Bureau stated that there were around 16.2 million veterans, most of whom can lend valuable insights to the nation's defense. The US military's veterans and active duty members carry this experience with them, ensuring that the lessons learned from past conflicts are applied to future challenges. So, when it comes to dealing with threats, both known and unforeseen, the US military's experience is a formidable advantage that should never be underestimated. But do you know what else shouldn't be underestimated? All the weaponry, techniques, and tactics that the US has never made public. Let's face it, what we do know about these capabilities is a deterrent enough for anyone who doesn't have a death wish. Now imagine the unknown, the capabilities that have been developed and kept under wraps. The mere thought should be enough to dissuade even the most daring of adversaries. In 2025 alone, the budget calls for $143.2 billion in research, development, tests, and evaluations. So that's why these classified weapons the US military could break out at any moment represent our 10th and final reason not to mess with the US. The classic and irreplaceable fear of the unknown. So, what do you say? Are you shocked at all by the abilities and capabilities the US has? And more importantly, do you think they're enough to dissuade the US's enemies from making the fatal mistake of messing with this superpower? If so, please share with us which of the 10 reasons you found the most compelling in the comments section below. And of course, feel free to add your reasons why messing with the US is a big no-no. While we're on the topic, if you're interested in videos like this one, feel free to check out why the US military has so many bases around the world, or one of our other videos on why the US defense plan is nigh on unbeatable. Thanks for watching, and take care out there. As a nation, the United States stands resolute. Even if all of the country's enemies raised their forces and struck simultaneously, the vast resources, formidable military, and resilient spirit of the nation would undoubtedly prevail. As a whole, the US is nigh on uninvadable. But that's the important part, only as a whole. But what about the individual states? How would they fare in the face of an invasion? Today, we're going to find out which US state would be the most vulnerable in the face of a modern invasion, and which would stand as an impenetrable bastion. There are virtually no lists discussing the hardest US states to invade that don't rank this non-contiguous US state at least near the top. And for good reason. Alaska's location in the far northwest of North America provides a formidable defense. Its rugged terrain, thousands upon thousands of miles of icy landscapes, and vast uninhabited expanses creates natural fortifications that would challenge even the most determined invader. The state's freezing temperatures, which once reached nearly 80 degrees below zero Fahrenheit or 62 degrees below zero Celsius in Prospect Creek, serve as an additional deterrent, making any attempted invasion a perilous endeavor. That's not to mention how challenging getting the invasion forces to Alaska would be in the first place. Most of the 34,000 miles of Alaska's shorelines are virtually impossible to land on. At the same time, any ground invasion would have to go through the 1,450-mile-long Canada-Alaska border, which features some of the wildest and most challenging terrain in North America. Simply put, invading Alaska would be a logistical nightmare. But for argument's sake, let's say the invading force does get through the rugged terrain and icy weather somehow. What will wait for them on the other side is a rather robust military presence. With over 665,000 square miles of land but only 733,000 inhabitants, Alaska is the most sparsely populated state in the US. However, this also means that it has the second highest concentration of military servicemen in the US, with 20,757 active duty service members and another 7,266 National Guard and Reserve members. There are also 9 military bases based in Alaska: Clean Air Force Station Base in Denali Borough, USCG Juneau Coast Guard Base in Juneau, Marine Safety Unit Valdez Coast Guard Base in Valdez, ISC Kodiak Coast Guard Base in Kodiak Island, Fort Greely Arm Base, Eelson Air Force Base, and Fort Wainwright Army Base, all near or in Fairbanks, and the Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage. At Fort Greely, the Army houses the ground-based Mid-Course Defense Anti-Ballistic Missile System, making Alaska one of only 2 U.S. states to possess such a crucial defense capability. This major component of the U.S. missile defense strategy enhances Alaska's own defenses, which are already formidable. Fairbanks, where Fort Greely is located, is also one of the top defense spending locations in Alaska, with $451.4 million spent in 2022, while Anchorage accounts for about a quarter of the state's $4 billion defense spending in 2022. Besides the heavily fortified military bases, Alaska boasts quite a few forts that can be used as defensive strongholds. These include Fort Hall, located on the Kenai Peninsula, and Fort Abercrombie on Kodiak Island. As you can see, Alaska is a heavily fortified hub that can withstand an intense and prolonged invasion attempt on its own. But that's just the thing. Alaska would have to do it mostly on its own. Just as the enemy forces would have a hard time reaching the state, any reinforcements and resources would also face significant challenges due to the state's isolation. Since Alaska shares no land border with the US, the only 4 interstates in the state, A1, A2, A3, and A4, are severely limited in their reach and connectivity. And that's why Alaska doesn't actually claim the title of the hardest US state to invade on our list. The next state we'll discuss certainly has no issues with connectivity. One of the busiest interstates in the US, I-95, hugs its southern coast. Does that advantage make it one of the most difficult to invade? Let's head to Connecticut and find out. In addition to I-95, Connecticut is served by 5 more interstates: I-84, I-91, I-291, I-384, and I-691. Connecticut's strategic location in the Northeast Corridor also provides it with access to major urban centers like New York City and Boston, further enhancing its logistical advantages. Unfortunately, that's about it for Connecticut. The 48th smallest U.S. state has only 4 major military installations, with only 2 of them being traditional military bases: the Marine Safety Center Marine Base and the Naval Submarine Base New London in Groton. The remaining 2, the Coast Guard Academy in New London and the Research and Development Center Coast Guard in Groton, do contribute to Connecticut's defense but focus more on training and research rather than active military operations. And in fact, the US Army, Navy, and Marine Corps all have precisely 0 bases in the state of Connecticut. Nature is also not much of a help when it comes to defending the state of Connecticut. Sure, there are some natural barriers like the Connecticut River, which cuts through the center of the state, and the Bear Mountain, which is some 2,300 feet in elevation. However, these features are relatively minor compared to the more substantial geographical defenses found in other states. Connecticut is also the 4th most densely populated state in the US, which makes any defense logistic planning a lot more complicated. Alright, it's not looking great for Connecticut in the event that they're invaded, but to be fair, Connecticut seems to be well aware of its shortcomings, which is why the state has seen the highest increase in Department of Defense spending in 2022. The state ranked among the top 10 spenders for the year with $22.3 billion, spent primarily in 3 locations: New London, Hartford, and Fairfield. This willingness to invest more in defense has saved Connecticut from being ranked as the easiest U.S. state to invade on our list. Though Connecticut is escalating its military spending, it's still far from matching the next state we'll discuss: California. With $56.2 billion spent on defense in 2022, more than twice that of Connecticut, California ranks as the 3rd biggest spender in the U.S. Given the sheer number of defense contractors, research institutions, and military bases located in California, this figure shouldn't be surprising. In terms of contract spending, as much as $11.9 billion was spent just in San Diego in 2022. San Diego is where some of the largest U.S. military installations are based. The installations in question are the Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base with over 42,000 active-duty military personnel and the San Diego Naval Base with over 24,000 military personnel. But these 2 military bases are only a tiny fraction of California's insane military presence. In fact, the state is ranked number 1 for the total number of military bases within a single state. Some of these bases include the Sierra Army Depot Army Base in Herlong, the Military Ocean Terminal Concord Navy Base in Concord, Los Alamitos Joint Forces in Los Alamitos, Camp San Luis Obispo Army Base in San Luis Obispo, Camp Roberts Army Base in Monterey, Los Angeles Air Force Base in El Segundo, Edwards Air Force Base in Edwards, and Fort Irwin Army Base in Barstow. And that's not even all of them. As you can see, if an invasion of the state was ever attempted, California appears more than ready for the challenge. This readiness is also the result of the highest number of active duty personnel stationed within a single state, with 158,784 troops. If more troops or equipment are necessary, they can arrive in California hassle-free. After all, almost 30 interstates crisscross the state, providing a seamless network for rapid troop movements and logistical support, including major thoroughfares like I-5, I-10, and I-15. The same goes for the many coastal bases that enable quick naval and air force deployment. However, California's 840-mile coast can be seen as a disadvantage. While the rest of the state's geography, which includes both the highest and lowest points in the contiguous U.S., Mount Whitney and Death Valley respectively, mostly works in its favor, the easily accessible coastline introduces numerous defense vulnerabilities. That's why California, despite all its military might, isn't ranked number 1 on our list of the hardest U.S. states to defend. Speaking of military might, that's precisely what the next U.S. state we'll examine lacks. With only 290 active-duty personnel stationed in the state, Vermont has one of, if not the weakest military presences in the entire U.S. It doesn't get better when discussing the total number of military bases available in the state. There are only 2. One is located in Burlington and the other in Northfield, and they both house the Vermont Air National Guard. The biggest threat the last base poses is that it houses the 158th Fighter Wing, which was the first Air National Guard unit to serve as home to the F-35A Lightning II fighter jets, aka the world's most advanced combat aircraft. However, that's pretty much where the military and technological achievements of Vermont end. In 2022, this state was ranked last by the Department of Defense based on defense spending. Only about $600 million was spent for these purposes, with 90% going to equipment and supplies. In terms of defense personnel locations, Chittenden in northwest Vermont had the most significant presence, with $276.7 million spent on defense contracts and $130.2 million spent on personnel. Since Vermont would be in desperate need of more troops and equipment in case of an invasion, it's worth examining the state's connectivity network. In a word, this network can be described as poor. Only 4 interstates serve the state: I-89, I-91, I-93, and a small segment of I-189. These highways, while crucial for regional travel, do not provide the extensive infrastructure necessary for rapid, large-scale troop movements or the transport of heavy military equipment. Additionally, Vermont's rural and mountainous terrain further complicates logistics, making it challenging to quickly mobilize and support military forces within the state. This terrain, however, can be somewhat of a lifeline to Vermont in case of an invasion, especially when you consider how well Vermont's militia has adapted to these conditions. Remember, this wouldn't be the first time guerrilla warfare managed to successfully repel an invading force. So, although Vermont ranks last on many national lists, it doesn't rank last among our easiest states to invade. While Vermont may see some immense benefits from its geography, our next state does as well. So let's go to the state that you may be surprised to learn has arguably the most natural defenses of any state in the country: Virginia. To the west, there are the Appalachian Mountains, which are legendary in their own right. The dense forests and rugged terrain of the Appalachians are ideal for defense strategies and guerrilla tactics, providing ample cover and challenging pathways for enemy movements. Additionally, the Shenandoah Valley, nestled within the Appalachians, serves as a natural corridor that can be easily defended. Similarly, the Chesapeake Bay, located to the east, offers extensive river systems that can be strategically used to control access and movement. That's why it shouldn't be surprising this bay houses quite a few historical forts, such as Fort Wool, which could be used to bolster defensive efforts. The entire 7,213-mile-long coastline is fortified by naval bases and ports, creating a virtually impenetrable shield. Speaking of military bases, Virginia has dozens of them, ranking in the top 5 of U.S. states in this category. More importantly, Virginia is home to the country's largest military base, the Naval Station Norfolk, which houses over 82,000 military personnel. Other notable bases distributed across all military branches include the Marine Corps Air Facility Quantico in Quantico, Fort Belvoir Army Base in Fairfax, Langley Air Force Base in Hampton, NAS Oceana Naval Base in Virginia Beach, and the National Maritime Center Coast Guard in Arlington. Besides an impressive number of military bases, Virginia also boasts a significant number of active duty troops, 125,162 to be precise. According to these 2022 estimates, Virginia is second only to California. However, when it comes to military spending in 2022, Virginia comes on top. But Virginia doesn't just trump California in military spending, it trumps all the US states. With $62.7 billion spent in 2022, almost 10% of its state gross domestic product, or GDP, Virginia demonstrates unparalleled commitment to national defense. Approximately 26% of this figure was allocated to equipment and technological advancements, with as many as 8 cities scoring defense contracts worth at least $1 billion. Those 8 cities are as follows: Fairfax with $17.8 billion, Arlington with $4.4 billion, Newport News City at $3.6 billion, Norfolk at $3.2 billion, Virginia Beach City at $2.2 billion, Prince William at $2.1 billion, Alexandria City at $1.7 billion, and Loudoun with $1.2 billion. Of course, all these figures are warranted, given that the headquarters of the very epicenter of the U.S. military strategy and operations, the Pentagon, is located in Arlington County. Though there are a few reasons for this, Virginia's strategic location is chief among them. You see, Virginia is located within easy reach of important military defense hubs, thanks to major transportation networks. As many as 16 interstate routes crisscross the state, facilitating rapid movement of troops and equipment. These routes include I-64, I-66, and I-95, which connect Virginia with key military installations and supply routes across the eastern seaboard and beyond. As impressive as Virginia is, it lacks the sheer resilience and tradition of disaster preparedness that our number one choice has. But before we reveal the hardest US state to invade, let's spend some more time on the opposite end of the spectrum. Among the states that, while vital in other respects, simply don't offer the same level of defense against potential invasion. Delaware might be known as a financial services hub, but it certainly doesn't match up when it comes to defensive capabilities. In the entire 2,500 square miles of Delaware, there's only one major military base, the Dover Air Force Base in Dover. This means there are no Army, Navy, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard bases in the state. Approximately 3,339 military personnel are assigned to this base, which is 96.6% of all active duty soldiers in the state, according to 2022 estimates. Delaware doesn't excel in technological capabilities either. The 2022 military budget saw only $700 million spent on defense, with only 11% of it going to supplies and equipment. These funds were distributed among 3 locations: Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, with the third one receiving only a tiny fraction of the total budget compared to the first 2. But the lack of technological capabilities isn't the only aspect that makes Delaware vulnerable. A lack of significant natural barriers, flat terrain, and high population density also contribute to that vulnerability. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that this second smallest state in the US could be invaded relatively easily. The only saving grace for Delaware is its proximity to major metropolitan areas, which could potentially facilitate a rapid response or intervention from nearby states, potentially via one of the 3 interstates in the state: I-95, I-295, and I-495. The same can't be said for the weakest state on our list, which is located further away to the northeast. But we won't travel there just yet. For now, we'll travel in the opposite direction on the map, the southwest, to reveal the state we deem the hardest to invade in the US. If you know anything about the US's history, geography, and military, you probably won't be surprised by our number 1 pick. It's the one and only Texas. Trying to invade the Lone Star State would probably be the biggest mistake any adversary could make. Why? Because there isn't a single aspect that works against the formidable defenses of Texas, which is well on its way to becoming the most powerful state in the entire US. Let's look at some facts. Texas has a robust military presence, with 112,583 active duty personnel recorded in 2022. Add the reservists in, and you have 177,072 people ready to defend Texas to the bitter end. These servicemen are deployed across dozens of military bases, 2 of which rank among the top 10 largest military installations in the world. The bases in question are the Fort Hood Army Base in Killeen, with over 70,000 military personnel, and Fort Bliss Army Base in El Paso, with over 20,000 servicemen. However, the U.S. Army isn't the only branch present in Texas, one of the favorite states for the military. So are the U.S. Navy and Air Force. Here's a quick overview of the major bases in this military powerhouse. San Antonio, renowned for its strong military presence, is home to several critical bases: Martindale Army Airfield Army Base, Camp Bullis Army Base, Lackland Air Force Base, Brooks City Air Force Base, and Fort Sam Houston Army Base. And there's many, many other notable bases too. Texas is also heavily investing in its defense infrastructure, reflecting its strategic importance. The 2022 $58 billion military budget focused primarily on equipment and supplies, with 68% spent in this area. Meanwhile, 26% went to the servicemen and 6% to research and development. As much as $18.6 billion in defense contracts was allocated to Tarrant County, the home of Fort Worth, famous for its aviation and aerospace industries. Though Texas doesn't lack any military force, any additional forces and equipment could reach the state swiftly, thanks to its central location served by over 20 interstates. There's also terrain diversity, from rugged hills and vast deserts to dense forests and sprawling plains. Each region presents a unique challenge for the invading forces. Throw the three rivers forming natural state borders, the Rio Grande, Red River, and Sabine River, and it becomes obvious that Mother Nature contributed to Texas being a virtually impregnable fortress against any would-be invaders. And let's not forget about the size of Texas. At 268,820 square miles, Texas is the second largest U.S. state, behind only Alaska. So even without all the military bases, personnel, and technology, the sheer expanse of the Lone Star State would make it nearly impossible to invade and quickly subdue. Though, let's be honest, even if there was no military, the citizens of Texas might rise to defend the state on their own. Which brings us to the last reason why this state is ranked number 1, Texas pride. While this metric admittedly can't be measured as accurately as military might and natural barriers, it's a force to be reckoned with nonetheless. Texas pride is a powerful, unyielding sentiment that binds the state's residents together with an almost mythic sense of duty and resilience, captured in 2 simple words: Texas forever. State pride is also precisely what the weakest state on our list misses, according to many polls. Well, pride and quite a few other crucial defense aspects. The less than flattering title of the easiest U.S. state to invade belongs to Rhode Island. Why? Simply put, everything about Rhode Island is small. At 1,214 square miles, Rhode Island is the smallest U.S. state, instantly making it an easy target. The state only has around 3,000 active duty personnel, which is a fraction compared to numbers found in most other states. There are only 3 military bases, none of them representing the Army or the Air Force. One among them, the Station Point Judith USCG Narragansett, uses only 30 people and a few boats to conduct operations in almost 70 miles of coast. There are also only 3 interstates crisscrossing the state: I-95, I-195, and I-295, which leaves minimal routes for rapid deployment and defense reinforcements. And finally, Rhode Island's military budget for 2022 was $1.6 billion, only 23% of which was spent on equipment. The largest chunk of this money was invested in a single city, Newport, leaving the rest of Rhode Island to rely on limited resources and minimal infrastructure. Other aspects of Rhode Island's geography would also do little to help it repel an invasion on its own. The state is mostly flat, with Jeremoth Hill at only 812 feet above sea level serving as its highest natural point. Also, virtually the entire Rhode Island can be quickly reached from the water's edge, allowing a would-be invader to easily approach from multiple directions. In approximately 45 minutes, an invading force could traverse the state's entire perimeter, overwhelming its spare defenses and swiftly establishing control. There are few, if any, natural barriers to slow them down. Luckily, this is all theoretical, and our ocean state likely won't have to deal with any similar scenarios. But what do you think are the easiest and hardest US states to invade? Was our list accurate? Share all your thoughts, opinions, and additions in the comments section below. And as always, thanks for watching and take care out there. The evidence is undeniable. Americans are more polarized than ever. Polls show many Americans believe another civil war is inevitable. Would it be better to say goodbye to each other now before it gets to that point? If history is any indication, it's not very likely. 150 years after the Civil War ended, its wounds still haven't fully healed, yet its lessons begun to fade from memory. It seems like it's only a matter of time before another part of the country tries to stake a claim on independence. Let's take a look at what part of the country is most likely to secede, and how they might fare. New England. First, let's go way back and look at the first secession movement in the United States. We're not talking about the South, we're talking about New England. In his farewell address, George Washington warned against political parties as something that would divide the young nation. This lasted, not very long. Washington's successor, John Adams, was a Massachusetts man and a member of the Federalist Party. This gave a powerful voice to New England's concerns, but after Adams left office, New England's voice diminished for quite some time. The Federalist Adams was replaced by the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both from Virginia. During the Continental Congress, New England's fear of being dominated by the South had almost prevented the nation's formation altogether. Now the South was consolidating power, just as New England had feared. The northern states must be governed by Virginia or must govern Virginia, and there is no middle ground, warned New Yorker Aaron Burr. Additionally, the old families of New England disdained the Germans, Irish, and Scotch-Irish immigrants pouring into the country. These Puritan descendants distrusted the separation of church and state, as they saw public life as inextricably intertwined with private virtue. And, maybe there were some things in Jefferson's private life that made this not such a bad point. Federalist concerns were magnified by the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson, which threatened to further dilute Northern influence. Now, the Louisiana Purchase brought in Spanish, French, and Indians as well. As New England debated leaving a country barely a quarter of a century old, there was no question that they had the legal right to secede. People objected to the wisdom of seceding, not their legal right to do so. New Englanders like Charles Pinckney came to believe that secession was their only choice, and that for the movement to succeed, they needed New York to join. They conspired to elect Aaron Burr as New York's governor. Once elected, Burr would steer New York into joining the New England secession movement. But after an exceptionally acrimonious campaign, Burr narrowly lost the election. Alexander Hamilton publicly called Burr a dangerous man for entertaining the plot to secession. This was the impetus for the most famous duel in American history. Burr's killing of Hamilton made him a national villain, throwing off plans for New England's secession. After the War of 1812, the New England secession movement collapsed altogether, but its arguments would greatly influence Southern secessionists like John C. Calhoun. Scholarship and polling. But by the end of the Civil War, it became clear that states had no legal right to secede. The situation was codified by the Supreme Court in Texas v. White in 1869. The court ruled that because states had no right to secede, legislation passed by the Confederacy had no legal standing. And yet, secession movements are common across the United States. These movements typically have several things in common: an appeal to regional identity, the rhetoric of the American Revolution, and a commitment to achieving independence by nonviolent means, at least nominally. Support for secession may be stronger now than ever before. Barack Obama's re-election in 2012 led to petitions for secession from all 50 states, totaling nearly 1 million signatures. In 2015, both California and Oregon submitted ballot petitions for secession. A 2018 poll showed 68% of Americans supporting a state's right to peacefully secede. A 2021 poll showed that support for secession was strongest among Southern Republicans, although still widespread across the country. Scholars note that secession is incredibly uncommon in stable democracies like the United States. To secede without bloodshed, breakaway regions have to convince not just their own people to leave, but the rest of the country to let them go peaceably. There's a paradox here that makes seceding so difficult. Independence movements are most common in regions with a high degree of self-rule, which builds confidence in a region's ability to govern itself. But this autonomy undermines the need for independence in the first place, so that regions are less likely to find secession necessary in the first place. The reverse is also true. An oppressive central government increases the desire for independence, but the heavy boot obstructs the formation of secession movements. It's called the fear-confidence paradox, and scholars have used it to study secession movements in Scotland, Catalonia, and Quebec. But we're talking about the United States of America. If there's one thing we don't lack, it's confidence. So let's take a closer look at the secession movements bubbling under the surface of American life. Cascadia. Some secession movements involve individual states, some involve multiple states, and sometimes secession movements cross national borders entirely. Such is the case of Cascadia, a proposed independent state in the Pacific Northwest that would combine the states of Washington and Oregon with the Canadian province of British Columbia. Since its settlement by non-natives, Northwesterners have regarded themselves as a people apart, self-reliant pioneers, just a little more in touch with the natural world. Regional identity is heavily informed by environmental concerns. It's called bioregionalism, and proponents of Cascadian independence believe that the unique ecology of the Pacific Northwest is an argument for secession and self-government. The movement even has its own flag, featuring the evergreen Douglas fir. It's called the Doug flag. Named for the Cascade Mountains, at its greatest extent, the region includes parts of Montana, Utah, Idaho, Northern California, and as far north as the Yukon. An alternate name for the region is Salmon Nation, in tribute to the fish that sustained indigenous populations in the region for thousands of years. But most efforts focus on the urban cores of Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, which are increasingly connected. Sometimes talked about as an emerging mega-region, together, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia are home to 17 million people and generate $1.1 trillion in goods and services annually. In 2008, the Pacific Coast Collaborative mandated cooperation on both sides of the US-Canadian border on matters of forestry, fishing, disaster management, and transportation. Business owners describe a Cascadia technology corridor with Microsoft, Amazon, and Boeing in Seattle, Pentium and Nike in Portland, and world-class film and video game industries in Vancouver. Former Seattle Mayor Paul Schell is a believer in the shared future of the region, saying that Cascadia represents better than states, countries, and cities the cultural and geographical realities of the corridor. Enthusiasm is particularly strong on the Canadian side of the border, where support for independence rose from 17% to 27% just between 2018 and 2019. Younger Canadians are particularly likely to support secession and to feel estranged from British Columbia's closest neighbor, the conservative, oil industry-dependent Alberta to the east. In 1975, Ernest Callenbach published his influential novel Ecotopia about a fictional nation comprising Oregon, Washington, and parts of Northern California, where environmental concerns were the preeminent focus of politics. In 1986, Evergreen State College hosted the first Cascadia Bioregional Congress. The Cascadia movement attracts anti-capitalists and anarchists, people critical of nation-states generally. These people want to see borders erased. After Donald Trump was elected in 2016, visits surged to the Cascadia Now website. Yet the Cascadia movement has always held its progressive bona fides in uneasy tension with the region's libertarian roots. In the run-up to the Civil War, new territories wrestled with the question of joining with or without slavery. Oregon found it easier to ban people of African descent entirely, the only state to join with such a law. Since the 1970s, concurrent with the environmentalist strands pursuing their ecotopia, the region has been an object of white supremacist fantasies of a whites-only ethno-state they call the Northwest Territorial Imperative. The Cascadia name and flag have been appropriated by white supremacists like the Northwest Front, who call for a sovereign white nation in the Pacific Northwest. In 2017, a man who had posted on Facebook calling for Cascadia as a white homeland murdered 2 people on the Portland light rail. White nationalists in the region are notorious for using hipster imagery, mixing progressive rhetoric surrounding environmental issues with calls for racial purity, and hiding in Discord channels with names like Cascadian Coffee Company. So if you're in the Cascadia region and a new acquaintance asks if you want to join their online coffee company, it might be best to think twice. Aztlán. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico, they found the Aztecs living in the majestic city of Tenochtitlan. But the Aztecs had not always lived there. According to the Codex Albin, they originated far to the north, in a place called Aztlán. Historians tend to place Aztlán in either northwestern Mexico or the southwestern United States. In the centuries since, Aztlán has become a rally cry for indigenous rights and a symbol of Mexican land taken by the United States. In 1848, the Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The U.S. came away from the war with the future states of California, Utah, and Nevada, as well as parts of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Many people chose to stay in their homes even as the land changed hands. Their children became part Chicano, people of Mexican descent born in the U.S. During the activism of the 1960s, the Chicano movement asserted itself through groups like the Brown Berets with tactics drawn from the Black Panthers. They saw the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as illegitimate, whether by law or natural right. Some argued for the creation of the República del Norte, a Republic of the North, that would give the southwestern states to Mexico. In 1969, the spiritual plan of Aztlán declared the reincorporation of Aztlán as the Chicanos' inevitable destiny, which would combine the area lost in the Mexican-American War with the northwestern Mexican states of Baja, Sonora, and Chihuahua. This dream has been termed La Reconquista, the reconquest, in allusion to the Catholic reconquest of Muslim Spain. The dream of Aztlán is kept alive by academics like Charles Trujillo, a law professor at the University of New Mexico, who was quoted at least once saying that such a nation should be brought into being by any means necessary. But mostly he was satisfied that gradual demographic change would lead to a Chicano majority, which would vote to rejoin Mexico. Trujillo also had some fringe legal ideas relevant to secession movements elsewhere. He believed that the Articles of Confederation were not superseded by the Constitution, so the Articles' guarantee of states' sovereignty, freedom, and independence was still binding. Most legal scholars disagree and point out that, after all, the full name of the document was the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. José Angel Gutiérrez, a political science professor at the University of Texas, agrees that demographic replacements will put things right, saying, "This is our homeland and we are entitled to it. We are the host, everyone else is a guest," adding, "It is not our fault that whites don't make babies." La Reconquista has been embraced by the National Front of Mexico, which describes itself as third positionist and has half-heartedly refused claims of fascism. In addition to the lands of Aztlán, the openly expansionist National Front also calls for Mexico to annex parts of Central America. The dream of Aztlán has seeped deep into Mexican culture. Vicente Fox was a president of Mexico from 2000 to 2006. He described himself as president of 123 million Mexicans, 100 million in Mexico, and 23 million more in the United States. In 2008, Absolute Vodka was criticized for a billboard ad that showed Mexico with its pre-1848 borders. The company defended the billboard as hearkening to a time which the population of Mexico may feel was more ideal. Some believe that time is coming to us again, but these secession movements are not limited to joining with foreign countries or groups of states. Some calls come from just one state, California. Our biggest state by population and third biggest by area, it's no surprise that California has been the subject of numerous calls for independence. It's been included in plans to rejoin Mexico as part of the República del Norte. Northern California has been included in calls for an independent Cascadia. Even more than secession movements, California has been the subject of numerous plans for partition, 220 since it achieved statehood in 1850. It was partitioned once already, in 1804 when the Spanish divided Alta, or Upper California, which was dominated by Franciscan missionaries, from Baja California to the south, which was dominated by Dominicans. After the Mexican-American War, Alta California was claimed by the United States while Baja remained part of Mexico. In 1965, the California State Senate voted to divide the state in two, but the proposal died in the state assembly. In 1992, the opposite happened. A proposal for partition passed the assembly but died in the state senate. As cultural issues became more heated in the 2000s, plans for partition shifted from a simple north-south divide to divisions along cultural lines, severing metropolitan San Francisco and LA from more rural and conservative areas. Yet plans for outright secession have been few and far between, even though an independent California would have the fifth largest economy in the world. Yes, California is one political action committee advocating for California's secession. It was founded by Louis J. Marinelli, who had previously campaigned against gay marriage. Yet Marinelli claimed he'd since had a change of heart on LGBT issues and told journalists the best people to govern California are us Californians. In 2023, Yes California introduced a ballot measure proposing the secession of coastal cities. This time, Marinelli was explicit about wanting California out of the US to get the extreme far-left liberals and progressives who are ruining the country as a whole to go and build a progressive utopia of their own. Marinelli had spent 5 years teaching kindergarten in Russia, and Yes California was accused of taking Russian money. He now lives in Arkansas. A more genuine movement, one built by people who actually want to live there, is the California National Party, or CNP, which models itself on the Scottish National Party. The CNP supports secession but also has plans for the here and now: higher taxes on top earners, a federal reparations program, and a state bank of California to replace predatory payday loan services. As the home of Silicon Valley, the CNP advocates for a statewide innovation fund, which would support critical research into clean energy and water conservation. In this way, the CNP hopes to lay the groundwork for California's eventual independence. And for our next secession movement, we'll need to go west. No, not east. Don't worry, we'll get to those Texans. To the state that is already literally independent from the rest of the country: Free Hawaii. It's the last state to join the Union. Might it also be the first to go? The story of Hawaii's incorporation into the United States is recent enough and controversial enough to make independence there uniquely plausible. Europeans first discovered Hawaii in 1778. A century later, the native population had dropped by 90% due to violence and disease. Only 50,000 natives remained. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown in a plot that left Saner Dole president of an independent Hawaii, although the island became a U.S. territory just a few years later. Like indigenous groups across the Western Hemisphere, Native Hawaiians continue to suffer from poor health, low education, and high rates of unemployment and incarceration. The 1960s brought renewed focus to activist movements worldwide, and Hawaii was no exception. But whereas other movements receded at a decade's end, activism in Hawaii intensified through the 1980s as urbanization and increased tourism made issues of inequality more glaring. In 1993, Congress passed the Apology Resolution, which acknowledged that Queen Liliuokalani had been illegally deposed with backing by the United States. The 2009 Native Hawaiian Government Reorganization Act would have established federal recognition of an indigenous government, which the State Department would have to treat as one sovereign nation to another. Yet indigenous rights groups resisted the act, which would have placed a 20-year time limit on bringing claims against the U.S. government. The Reorganization Act is opposed by groups like Kalahui Hawaii, a grassroots group for Hawaiian sovereignty formed in 1987, which flies the Hawaiian state flag upside down as a symbol of distress and dissent. Another group, Kapakaukau, organized the People's International Tribunal in 1993, which brought together indigenous groups from around the world for a show trial, in which the U.S. government was tried for violations of international law and found guilty. Many groups pushing for Hawaiian independence envisioned the restoration of the royal line of Queen Liliuokalani. Others, like the nation of Hawaii, advocate for a republic. Some independence activists try to use legal maneuvering, arguing that Hawaii's annexation was not legally binding because of the U.S.'s repeated treaty violations. In 2015, the Department of the Interior announced its intention to formally recognize a tribal government of Native Hawaii. But activists say that, judging from examples on the mainland, tribal recognition will never lead to total sovereignty. A better path may be set by Pu'uhonua o Waimanalo, a 45-acre commune at the western edge of Oahu led by Dennis Kanahele, nicknamed Bumpy. In 1987, Kanahele led the takeover of an abandoned Coast Guard station and occupied it for 14 months, despite armed standoffs with police. Eventually, Kanahele was arrested and spent 14 months in jail, time he spent continuing to build his movement. 1993 was a busy year for Hawaiian activists. It was the 100-year anniversary of Queen Liliuokalani's overthrow. Kapakaukau brought together indigenous groups from around the world for the People's International Tribunal, and the U.S. issued the Apology Resolution in acknowledgement of the royal family's illegal deposition. Governor John Waihee, the first governor of indigenous Hawaiian ancestry, declared that independence was not a matter of if, but a matter of how, when, and in what form. That year, Bumpy Kanahele led 300 protesters to occupy Makapu Beach on Oahu. They began building houses, beachfront property at little expense but the risk to their lives. 15 months later, Governor Waihee offered a deal. The protesters would leave Makapu Beach in exchange for 45 acres at the foothills of the nearby Koolau Mountains to be leased for 55 years at a cost of only $3,000 per year. The group accepted. They set up a local government managed by 4 women they called the Council of Aunties. The commune sustains itself in part through marijuana cultivation, and it has cryptocurrency called Aloha Coin. But the Hawaiians are not the only indigenous group that have pushed for their own sovereign nation. Republic of Lakota. On December 17, 2007, a group of Lakota Indians announced their intention to withdraw from all treaties made with the U.S. government, declaring the independent Republic of Lakota. The group cited the 1969 Vienna Convention, which states that treaties can be nullified if one side has lied or violated human rights. The announcement came just months after the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a non-binding agreement that the U.S. had nevertheless refused to sign. The proposed Republic of Lakota would encompass roughly 93,000 square miles of land across the northern Great Plains states. The boundaries coincide with those set by the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie and are cited with great specificity. An irregular line marking the Yellowstone River to the north, the North Platte River to the south, the Missouri River to the east, and the west. Citizenship of the Republic of Lakota would be open to anyone willing to surrender their U.S. passport. The economy would depend on harnessing the massive amounts of wind power sweeping through the Great Plains. The Lakota people are part of the Sioux Nation. When Europeans arrived, they were small-scale agriculturalists living in the Ohio River Valley. With the disruption of colonialism, the Lakota moved west to the Great Plains, becoming skilled horsemen and buffalo hunters, eventually becoming the most powerful of the Sioux tribes. In 1851, the Lakota signed the first Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which they were promised dominion over the Great Plains in exchange for allowing American settlers to pass along the Oregon Trail. The treaty was to last as long as the river flows and the eagle flies. The second Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 promised tribal control of nearly half of modern-day South Dakota. But just a few years later, this agreement broke down with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. Despite Lakota victories like the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, the influx of gold prospectors could not be staunched. In 1877, the Lakota ceded the Black Hills to the U.S., but the cession is controversial, as such agreements were supposed to include the consent of 3/4 of Lakota men. In 1903, in Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the ability, known as plenary powers, to unilaterally terminate treaties with Indian tribes. Today, the Lakota occupy Pine Ridge Reservation in one of the poorest counties in the U.S. The reservation is being continuously checkerboarded as land is leased or sold to military, logging, and mining concerns. One estimate claims the loss of 50 million acres in just the last 50 years. Pine Ridge Reservation was the setting for the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, in which nearly 300 Lakota died. In 1973, the site was occupied for 71 days by members of the American Indian Movement, including activist Russell Means. Means was born on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1939. He joined the American Indian Movement and took part in its occupations of Alcatraz and Mount Rushmore before becoming an actor with roles in Last of the Mohicans, Disney's Pocahontas, and Curb Your Enthusiasm. In 1980, the Lakota joined other Sioux tribes in bringing suit against the United States for violation of treaties surrounding the Black Hills. The Supreme Court found in the tribe's favor and awarded them a settlement of $105 million. But the Sioux have refused the money because accepting it would mean forfeiting their claims to the land. Still, the money sits in an account gathering interest, awaiting acceptance. In addition to violation of treaty agreements, the 2007 delegation cited the dismal living conditions of the reservation. Pine Ridge and its neighbor, Rosebud Reservation, account for the 2 poorest counties in the U.S. In winter, the temperatures drop to Arctic levels and the wind howls through the poorly maintained houses. After presenting the State Department with notice of their secession, the delegation made contact with embassies of countries rife with anti-American feeling: Serbia, Venezuela, Bolivia. The great flaw in the plan was that they had no backing from their own tribal government. The delegation had proceeded on their own and was mostly based around the charismatic Russell Means. The Republic of Lakota maintains its website of legal documents, but its energies ebbed with the death of Means in 2012. But let's take a look at the region best known for its secession tendencies: the South. League of the South. 150 years after the Civil War, we find that the former states of the Confederacy still house some of the nation's most active secession movements. The League of the South is a neo-Confederate organization founded in 1994. which aims to establish a free and independent Southern Republic with a more traditional, church-focused way of life. Formerly part of the neo-Nazi Nationalist Front, the League of the South was instrumental in organizing the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, aka the one with the tiki torches, as well as a White Lives Matter rally in Shelbyville, Tennessee. It was designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2000. The League has some surprising connections to academia. Its president, Michael Hill, is a former history professor at the historically black Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, specializing in British history. The League abounds with imagery rooted in Celtic mythology. Hill himself often appears wearing the St. Andrew's cross of the Scottish flag. Another early founder, Thomas Woods, is a Harvard-educated historian and libertarian commentator who has since distanced himself from the group. An independent nation run by the League of the South would include severely limited immigration and no standing army, personal income, or property tax. Such a nation would re-stigmatize what it calls perversity and all that seeks to undermine marriage and the family. In addition to the Confederacy, the League takes inspiration from the Italian Lega Nord in the north of Italy, which similarly uses a supposed Celtic heritage to make its appeals for regional separatism. In 2006, the League of the South sent representatives to the first North American Secessionist Convention, which brought together independence groups from around the country. The next year, the League of the South co-hosted the event with the Second Vermont Republic, who we'll hear about more later. A militia for the League, called the Indomitables, eventually morphed into the Southern Defense Force. Members were recruited with the slogan, "Are you ready to be a man among men?" taken from posters recruiting for the Rhodesian Army in the 1960s. Rhodesia has become a popular touchstone for white nationalists because of their efforts to maintain a separate white ethno-state in Africa. In 2015, the group celebrated the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, feting his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, as a Southern hero. The League of the South's goal is to secede and establish an independent South that would ban interracial marriage and establish a quasi-feudal hierarchy composed of superiors, equals, and inferiors. Non-whites would be allowed in the country so long as they acknowledged the superiority of the Anglo-Celtic majority. But let's take a closer look at some of those other groups who attended the Independence Conference. Second Vermont Republic. In 2006, the State House in Montpelier, Vermont played host to an unusual gathering of groups from around the country. It was the first North American separatist convention, which brought together independence movements like Free Hawaii and the Alaskan Independence Party, as well as the League of the South and Christian Exodus, which aimed to establish a sovereign theocracy outside the United States. The meeting was hosted by a group called the Second Vermont Republic, or SVR, a secessionist group with a complex mixture of political allegiances. Thomas Naylor founded the SVR in 2003. In his self-published book, The Vermont Manifesto, Naylor lays out the group's primary goals: to end military entanglements abroad and pursue environmental justice. In 2004, the SVR issued the Middlebury Declaration, in which they detailed their plans to encourage secessionist movements around the world, in addition to their ultimate task, the peaceful dissolution of the American Empire. With the widespread belief that the war in Iraq was really about access to oil, it made sense to conflate environmental issues with a denunciation of American military power. In 2005, Naylor founded the Middlebury Institute with Kirkpatrick Sale, a New York Times journalist best known for leading a group called the Neo-Luddites and prone to anti-technology stunts like smashing computers on stage. Sale also wrote a book criticizing Columbus for human rights abuses. Vehemently anti-war and environmentalist, the SVR played to a certain image of Vermont progressivism, but this was far from the whole story. Naylor was born in Mississippi and was previously an emeritus professor of economics at Duke University. He moved to Vermont in 1993, feeling driven there by the violent crime plaguing American cities. In Vermont, Naylor became acquainted with retired diplomat George Kennan. Maybe the most famous diplomat of the 20th century, Kennan was known as the architect of the Cold War containment policy, but he was also an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War and later, the war in Iraq. Kennan suggested the United States be broken into a dozen or so smaller republics, believing that immigration from Latin American nations would soon make the country too culturally fragmented to function effectively. The SVR is deeply intertwined with the neo-Confederate movement. They share an intellectual mentor in Emory University Professor Donald Livingston, who has written extensively on the Civil War, framing it as one of unprovoked aggression by the North. Many SVR members are also part of the Abbeville Institute, the scholarly arm of the League of the South. Abbeville Institute member and Loyola University professor Thomas DiLorenzo wrote The Real Lincoln, a 2002 book postulating that the Civil War was fomented for the express purpose of eliminating the constitutional right of states to secede. By 2007, its second year, the Second Vermont Republic was co-hosting the Separatist Convention with the League of the South, and the meeting was capped with a group sing-along of Dixie, the unofficial national anthem of the Confederacy. But now it's time to get to the state that always comes to mind when talking about a single state trying to secede: Texas. The League of the South's plans for secession naturally include the economic powerhouse that is Texas. But Texas has plans for a nation of its own. In 2021, state representatives introduced a bill to leave the U.S. and establish an independent republic. It was a tremendous victory for the Texas nationalist movement and its president, Daniel Miller, who had been working towards it since 2005. Miller spreads awareness via the Texas First Pledge, in which signatories pledge to secure the Mexican border, promote cultural and economic self-reliance, and, most of all, support all actions or legislation that fully realizes the freedom and independence of Texas. More than 100 state and local candidates have signed the Texas First Pledge, including the reigning Commissioner of Agriculture. Like other secession groups, the Texas nationalist movement has received funds from the Russian government funneled through a nonprofit. It would be more surprising if Texas didn't have an active independence movement. The Lone Star State operated as a sovereign republic for only 10 years, from 1836 to 1846, but independence has been fondly remembered ever since. Political insiders speculate that Texas's affinity for independence comes in regular cycles, invariably when Democrats are in control of the federal government and can thus be safely ignored. Yet experts said similar things about the vote for Brexit, from which the Texas nationalist movement takes its own portmanteau: Texit. Calls for Texit surged in the wake of Biden's election in 2020 and the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. In 2020, Congressman Randy Weber posted an image on Facebook that showed Texas being forcibly pried from the rest of the country. The caption read, "I think it's getting about that time, y'all." And unlike other states, secession movements in Texas have enjoyed an unusual amount of institutional support. At a Tea Party rally in 2009, then-Governor Rick Perry voiced his belief that, because of its past as an independent republic, Texas alone retained the constitutional right to secede, although Perry later walked these comments back. In a speech at Texas A&M in 2021, Senator Ted Cruz told students, "We're not there yet, and if there comes a point where it's hopeless, when I think we take NASA, we take the military, we take the oil." In 2022, 5 of the 8 candidates in the Republican primary for governor publicly committed to Texit, together winning nearly a third of the vote. Texas may well be suited for independence. Its gross state product of about $2 trillion, second in the nation only to California, would give a sovereign state the 10th largest economy in the world, larger than that of both Canada and Australia. Meanwhile, the Texas Rangers would be poised to assume matters of national security. Yet, an independent Texas may still run into financial problems. In 2019, Texas paid $272 billion to the federal government, but received back $300 billion. Federal money typically comprises 1/3 of the state budget. One expert estimates that a nation of Texas would have to find a way to get an additional $9,000 or so per person living there, possibly through income or sales taxes. As a place with no state income tax currently, this may be a bridge too far. Alternatively, with the money kept closer to home, citizens of an independent Texas may find their hearts have grown just as big as the land. But the only state to have even more land than Texas also has ambitions of going it alone: Alaska. Alaska is a world apart. It's already bigger than many other countries. It has natural resources galore. Why shouldn't it give independence a try? Well, they're working on it. In 1958, Alaskans participated in a referendum on their future. Voters only had 2 choices: remain a territory or become a state. According to founders of the Alaskan Independence Party, or AIP, that made the whole thing illegitimate. Founded in 1973 by Joe Vogler, a former gold miner, the AIP argued that the 1958 referendum was invalid because it should have given voters the option of becoming an independent nation, or at least a commonwealth. Although it should be noted that the difference between a commonwealth and a state is pure semantics with no legal bearing. For decades, Vogler ran the AIP as a third party similar to the Theocratic Constitution Party, formerly the U.S. Taxpayers Party. He ran for governor in 1982 and proved his ability to think outside the box, proposing that troublesome glaciers be obliterated using nuclear weapons. In 1990, Wally Hickel, former Secretary of the Interior under Nixon, was elected governor on the AIP ticket, one of the few third-party candidates to win a governorship. In 1993, Joe Vogler was supposed to present his ideas on Alaskan independence to the United Nations, but before he had the chance to, he was killed in a robbery gone wrong. However, AIP members found the timing too convenient and suspected political assassinations with the robbery as a cover-up. However, this cover-up was never verified. Now, Governor Hickel had never endorsed the AIP's secession aims. In fact, he had been instrumental in achieving Alaskan statehood back in the 50s. After Vogel's death, Hickel rejoined the Republican Party. The new AIP chief, Mark Crisson, de-emphasized secession and brought the party more in line with other conservative third parties, staunchly pro-life, anti-gun control, favoring homeschooling and limited government. Instead of immediate secession, the AIP now called for another referendum with independence on the ballot. Still, the party sent delegates to the North American secessionist conventions. They made the requisite noises about states' rights, taxation as theft, and fear of a new world order. And Crisson nurtured a young politician named Sarah Palin, helping her become first mayor of Wasilla, then governor, and eventually the Republican candidate for vice president in 2008. That same year, Palin sent a videotaped message to the AIP convention in Fairbanks telling them to keep up the good work. Palin's message resounded with pioneer values, self-sufficiency, and limited government. Yet these frontier states are often the biggest recipients of government support. Proceeds from oil and mining extraction in the state are invested and kept in the Alaska Permanent Fund. As of 2019, the fund was worth approximately $64 billion and paid each resident an average annual dividend of $1,600. Some call it the nation's only functioning example of a universal basic income. Which leads us now to the Great Salt Lake, where a more historical example of secession awaits. Deseret. Like Texas, the most active secession movements can sometimes come from places that were once independent, however briefly. Such was the case for Deseret, the proposed nation-state of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as they're more commonly known, Mormons. After being chased out of Illinois, the first Mormons arrived in Salt Lake Valley in 1847. They initially petitioned for statehood under the name Deseret, which is the name of a honeybee in the Book of Mormon, a symbol of industriousness and community. As first proposed in 1850, the state of Deseret would have been massive, encompassing not just all of modern-day Utah, but portions of California, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, Arizona, Oregon, New Mexico, and Nevada. But the Mormons became targets of outrage for their practice of polygamy. Their first petition for statehood was denied, and in 1857, President James Buchanan sent 2,500 troops, roughly a third of the entire peacetime army, to quell unrest and replace Brigham Young as territorial governor. The so-called Utah War was settled largely by diplomatic means, give or take a massacre or two. Brigham Young stepped down and the non-Mormon population grew. In 1890, Wilford Woodruff, then president of the LDS Church, announced that the practice of polygamy amongst the Mormons was to end. Just 5 years after this change, Utah became the 45th state. In 2018, Twitter started seeing tweets marked #DesNat calling for the creation of a sovereign nation-state of Deseret, a Mormon-led theocracy with borders that encompassed and went beyond the modern state of Utah. Some users have employed neo-Nazi imagery to suggest that Deseret would be a white ethno-state. The hashtag was created by Logan Smith, a resident of Idaho who believed Mormons should be united spiritually, morally, economically, and politically. Users have been accused of harassing LGBT members, non-Mormons, feminists, and producers of pornography. The movement has also reintroduced the concept of blood atonement, an idea disavowed by the mainstream Mormons but common in fundamentalist circles. In 2021, journalists identified a prolific poster of racist and anti-Semitic Desnat content as Matthias Seacott, an assistant attorney general in Alaska. Seacott was eventually let go as a result of this. Like so much else online, the outrageousness of the tweets obscure the truth of the sentiments behind it, which likely range from full-throated believer to someone who claims to be just joking. New York. There may be no place in the country with a stronger claim to self-sufficiency than New York City, noted insomniac and engine of the world's financial markets. Yet New York has seen surprisingly few attempts at secession. During the lead-up to the Civil War, Democratic Mayor Fernando Wood proposed the city secede to become an independent city-state called the Free City of Tri-Insula, composed of Manhattan, Long Island, and Staten Island. Like many Northerners, Mayor Wood feared the disruption of the cotton trade with Europe. Wood's proposal never got very far, and it was totally deflated by the patriotic fervor that accompanied the war's outbreak. Still, the war remained deeply unpopular in the city, culminating in the draft riots in 1863. Upstate from the city, one town did go so far as to formally secede. The residents of Town Line, New York voted to secede, but because the town was unincorporated, the vote had no legal bearing, and the Confederacy declined to recognize the breakaway hamlet. With no legal recognition of their secession, Town Line could only ceremonially rejoin the Union, which they did in 1946. Generally, New York has been geared more toward partition than secession. In 1969, author Norman Mailer ran for mayor on a platform that would have made New York City the nation's 51st state. In Mailer's version, the city would get to keep the name New York. The rest of the state could call itself Buffalo. When then-Mayor Michael Bloomberg testified in 2011 that the city paid $11 billion more to the state in taxes than it received back, it reignited calls for New York City to go its own way. Meanwhile, parts of upstate New York are sometimes just as eager to get away, feeling overlooked in state politics and wary of environmentalist legislation like bans on fracking. As the memory of the Civil War recedes into the past, secession may seem more like a plausible solution for our polarized nation. Whether that rupture appears in the heart of the old Confederacy or at the western edges of empire, the first successful independence movement may create a chain reaction of imitators. If nothing else, school children all over the country will need a new wording for their daily recitation: one nation, indivisible. It's an all-out battle royale in the United States. Each of the 50 states have splintered into countries of their own, and now they're all looking for a fight. But when it comes to the winner, there can only be one. There will be no alliances in this battle, with each state truly fending for itself. With that being said, we start with a true titan of the US, Texas. They say everything is bigger in Texas, and that's certainly the case when it comes to the state's sheer strength. Texas has over 166,000 military members that call the state home. Over 104,000 of those people are part of the Army. Of those 104,000 Army units, the National Guard numbers around 19,000 members, who maintain 117 armories in 102 communities throughout Texas. Add to that an additional 5,500 Marines, and you have a powerful land force. Guarding the Texas coast, you have over 13,000 units from both the Navy and the Coast Guard. And if that's not enough, there's over 42,000 Air Force personnel who also contribute to this powerhouse of a state. The Lone Star State's strategy then becomes simple: defend itself using the National Guard and Navy while sending its Army and Air Force personnel out to attack others. It's a sound strategy, aided in no small part by Texas's geography. To the west of the state lie the Guadalupe Mountains. While not the largest or highest mountain range in the US, the range does include Guadalupe Peak, which has an 8,751-foot summit. Those mountain ranges will help Texas defend against incursions from the west as its army moves throughout the US. Also, much of far west Texas is covered by the Chihuahuan Desert. Stretching throughout portions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico as well, the desert is North America's largest at 250,000 square miles. Texas is also ready to fuel its armies. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says that there are 20,309 million barrels of crude oil in the state, with those who aren't on fighting duty tasked with getting as much of that oil out of the ground as quickly as possible to keep the state's soldiers equipped with the fuel they'll need. Finally, there's the Texan X Factor. It's citizens. As of 2021, there were 1,006,555 registered firearms in Texas, easily making the state's citizens the most armed in the U.S. Texas has about twice as many guns as the second-place state, Florida, with 518,725, and that armed citizenry will be called upon if any other state is foolish enough to try and invade. Add to that an already growing appetite for independence in Texas, with 33% saying they'd support Texas splitting off as an independent country, and you have a state that's well-armed with citizens who are willing to fight. An early frontrunner emerges, but if another powerful state can increase their military by overtaking multiple states quickly, Texas could be in real trouble. So let's take a look at Texas's first move. Advancing quickly to the west, Texas puts New Mexico in its crosshairs. Militaristically, the state has no chance. Just over 17,000 personnel are stationed in New Mexico, with only about 3,500 of those being Army and Marines. Texas's ground forces are easily able to overwhelm them. The state does have a solid air force, however, with around 14,000 personnel. But again, Texas is able to overcome this. Its air force is 3 times the size of New Mexico's. That air force also allows Texas to easily navigate the portions of the Chihuahuan Desert that run through the state, making this fight an easy victory for Texas. New Mexico is out of the running early, thanks to Texas. Oklahoma is next. Oklahoma is a minnow compared to their southern neighbor, but they've got a few tricks up their sleeve. Initially, Oklahoma's roughly 21,000 soldiers aren't able to stand up to the might of the Texan army. But Oklahoma can take advantage of its own geography. Its soldiers try to funnel the Texans into the expansive Red Beds plains and high plains, leaving them open to bombing runs by the over 10,000 Air Force personnel stationed in the state. But that tactic doesn't take Oklahoma too far, especially once its Air Force is confronted by Texas's superior aerial might. Granted, the Arbuckle Mountains to the central south of the state force Texas to invade from the southwest, again landing in Great Plains territory, but there's nothing Oklahoma can do in terms of sheer manpower. Another state down. Texas continues its rampage to the east, turning its attention to Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Its tactic is becoming clear: create a buffer region of states that surround it, making it even more difficult for other states to invade Texas itself. Arkansas goes down quickly. It only has around 8,000 total active military personnel, who are no match for a Texan military that's more than 13 times its size. Louisiana's 30,000 soldier military put up more of a fight, though the state also offers Texas an opportunity to use its navy. Louisiana's long coast bordering the Gulf of Mexico is only defended by about 2,400 Navy and Coast Guard personnel. Easy pickings for the same Texan group of over 13,000. Finally, there's Mississippi. The state has the same problems as Louisiana, as its installed military numbers around 25,000, and it has a coast leading into the Gulf of Mexico. The key difference? It has a much larger Navy and Coast Guard. The state holds out for a while with its 5,300 personnel fighting valiantly against Texas, but with just 10,300 Army and Marines on the ground, Mississippi's Navy will ultimately be left out to sea without a friendly port to return to. So, Texas just occupies Mississippi's Navy until its ground forces can take the state. With 5 states down, Texas takes a moment to consolidate, while 2 other challengers are consolidating their own power in the east and west. We'll start in the west, where California is throwing its weight around. With 32 military bases, including Naval Base San Diego, which is the home port of the powerful Pacific Fleet, California has the strongest military presence in the United States, with 213,600 total soldiers. Break it down, and you get 34,600 Army soldiers, 61,500 Marines, 29,100 Air Force personnel, 5,600 Coast Guard members, and the California X Factor, the Pacific Fleet, which includes 82,900 sailors. California quickly puts that fleet to work, focusing on one of the most isolated states in the U.S., Hawaii. Hawaii has sat back and watched as Texas completed its rampage. It had hoped to sit out until the other states had weakened themselves, defending itself by virtue of being nearly 2,400 miles away from San Francisco. Nestled in the Pacific Ocean, it has a fairly decent military presence of 54,300 soldiers, divided across several islands. But they're not a match for California's powerful navy. The Pacific Fleet is sent out, buffeting Hawaii from every angle. Soon sounds the death knell for the Aloha State. Constant missile bombardments coupled with strikes from aircraft taking off from the USS Nimitz overwhelm the islands before they can become a major threat. California has its first victory. Soon, California's land-based forces of the Army, Marines, and Air Force are moving east across the U.S. Nevada is the next obvious target. An easy victory for California, as Nevada only has 4,800 Marines and Army soldiers compared to California's 96,000. Still, the 50,000 square mile Mojave Desert presents an obstacle. Though it's the smallest desert in North America, the Mojave is also the driest and represents a large portion of flat land the California Army has to navigate. It does so while being buffeted by airstrikes from the large, nearly 13,000-strong Air Force stationed in Nevada. But California was smart. It has an Air Force of its own, 29,100 strong, and it uses those craft to bomb Las Vegas, Reno, and everywhere in between to take Nevada. That tactic of supporting an army with overwhelming air power serves California well as it attacks Oregon. By this time, the Pacific Fleet has started to make its way back from attacking Hawaii, and it's helpful in taking the Beaver State. California barely has to put any boots on the ground. Oregon's 32,600 military personnel quickly fall to the state's combined aerial and naval power. Meanwhile, Texas has turned its attention to Arizona. The home of the Grand Canyon benefits from vast desert tracts, as well as the canyon itself, making it difficult for an invading force to march. The problem is that Texas has a massive advantage. The almost 31,000 military personnel from Arizona can't do a thing to stop Texas's military, which is almost 6 times stronger. And with that, Texas arrives at the southeastern border of California, preparing another attack. California has been using the Pacific Fleet to attack Washington as this happens. Again, the overwhelming force of that fleet and its missile strikes win the day. Washington can do little to fight against the Pacific Fleet when its Navy and Coast Guard only have about 26,000 members. Again, California doesn't have to put boots on the ground other than to finalize taking the state, as its Navy and Air Force do the work. With that job done, the Pacific Fleet heads back towards Naval Base San Diego. It's going to be forced into a defensive mode soon enough. Texas plans to invade from the southeast, using the newly taken Arizona as its entry point. That's not the easiest route, though. Arid plains, mountains, and dunes impede the progress of its ground forces. The Sierra Nevada mountain range pushes Texan forces through a choke point into California's south. Ideal for the Pacific Fleet to start bombarding them with missiles and aerial firepower. A standoff develops. Texas can pour troops through California's southeast with little resistance on the ground, though the presence of the Pacific Fleet can warn them off. All the while, Florida is advancing from the east. Florida has the 5th largest military presence in the U.S., with 102,700 personnel. It has a solid mix of Army and Marines, together equaling 31,300 units, though it's the Navy, Coast Guard, and Air Forces that are the standouts. 40,400 and 31,000 personnel respectively make up Florida's forces. As mentioned earlier, it also has a powerful civilian army, thanks to more than 500,000 registered firearms being in the state. Much like Texas, Florida will maintain its citizens, keeping them armed and ready to fight against invading forces. Georgia and Alabama are first on the Floridian agenda. Alabama puts up a good fight thanks to its 19,000-strong Army and Marines being almost a match for Florida's similar ground forces. But while the bay just outside of Alabama's capital, Mobile, gives Alabama quick access to the Gulf, it also gives Florida's superior Navy a direct route to the seat of Alabama. Alabama's 1,300 Navy and Coast Guard fall easily to their 40,000 Floridian counterparts. It looks like Alabama's days are over. Georgia, however, presents more of a problem for Florida. Its 110-mile coastline might provide plenty of entry points for the Floridian Navy, but the 15 barrier islands give Georgia some strategic positions from which they can defend. Additionally, it shares a border with Florida and has 67,800 Army and Marines, compared to Florida's 31,300. How could Florida make up the difference? Well, it's here that Florida's heavily armed citizenry comes into play. 500,000 people defend Florida as Georgia is buffeted by aerial strikes and naval attacks. Eventually, the state falls, though its army puts a big dent in Florida's civilian defenses. With those border states secured, Florida turns its attention to Texas. Its naval and aerial forces station themselves in the Gulf of Mexico as its army marches toward Texas. The ground forces face little resistance as they move through Mississippi and Louisiana, as Texas has pulled the bulk of its forces to fight against California. So it's not long before Floridian soldiers are approaching the eastern border of Texas. As this is happening, a great fight is waged between North and South Carolina. The former has a clear advantage militarily, thanks to having nearly 115,000 military personnel compared to South Carolina's 53,600. The Blue Ridge Mountains in South Carolina's northwestern corner offer it small respite, though they're not enough to stop North Carolina from marching in. The aerial and naval battles are fairly evenly matched, but North Carolina's large contingent of Marine Corps is its X factor. 40,800 Marines versus South Carolina's 8,200 ultimately leads to a North Carolina victory. But that victory is short-lived. So swept up in fighting South Carolina, North Carolina forgets about Virginia. The latter's mountainous west has helped defend it against Tennessee, though that state only has 20,100 military personnel to begin with. But to its north, North Carolina is vulnerable to incursion from Virginia's 147,000 military personnel. Two evenly matched state militaries collide, though it's Virginia's stronger Navy and Air Force that wins the day. An 84,700-person strong Navy and Coast Guard dominates the coastal plain to North Carolina's east and allows Virginia to take the state. Tennessee is mopped up soon after, its 13,400 Army and Marine forces being no match for Virginia's comparable 45,500. West Virginia is another easy win for Virginia. 5,200 military personnel can't do much against Virginia's over 147,000-strong military. Kentucky soon follows, with Virginia relying on its much stronger 15,800 Air Force to counteract the fact that Kentucky has 42,500 Army members on the ground and only 1,400 in their skies. Meanwhile, Texas is in trouble. Florida is fighting against its Navy in the Gulf, while the California and Pacific Fleet attacks the troops it's trying to send into California. It's still getting soldiers through despite the 96,100 people California has on the ground, but Texas is losing a lot of people. It's here where the state's X factor comes into play. Eventually, Florida has to use its navy to start landing people in the state, where they face a civilian army of over 1 million armed citizens, plus the Texas National Guard. That's too much for Florida to handle, even with its superior naval power, as it only has an Army and Marine force of 31,300, and its own well-armed civilians are isolated within Florida to protect it from attack. Texas also has a much larger air force than Florida, allowing it to pepper Florida's navy with aerial strikes. It's a hard-fought battle, but Texas comes out on top, thanks to its civilian forces. And now, with no direct threats, it's able to send National Guard and armed citizens toward California. As all of this has been happening, New York has been consolidating a solid power base to the northeast. Though it doesn't have the largest military of the states, just 46,900 personnel in total, it has benefited from the states with larger militaries fighting among themselves. That's left it free to take advantage of its $1.78 trillion economy, third only behind Texas and California, to keep its soldiers well supplied and capable of taking many of the smaller states that surround it. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts all fall quickly to New York, as do Rhode Island and Connecticut. New Jersey puts up more of a fight as it has 24,000 military personnel. However, it's been using its 8,900-person strong Air Force to take on Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Delaware falls quickly. It only has 8,100 personnel, and the 2,100 soldiers it has on the ground can't fend off New Jersey and its Air Force. The latter two are more than capable of putting up a fight against New Jersey, with Maryland's 47,600 personnel, which include 14,600 naval personnel and 12,200 Air Force personnel, eventually putting a halt to New Jersey's attacks. However, the 14,600 personnel in the District of Columbia have caused problems as Maryland fought off New Jersey. Though Maryland wins that battle as well, taking a second state, it's severely weakened and can't defend itself against the economic powerhouse of New York. The Maryland numbers advantage whittles away, and it eventually falls, though New York is weakened in the process. With those early victories completed, New York is consolidated, surrounded by buffer states. It's going to have to turn its attention to Pennsylvania next, its large neighbor to the south. Back on the West Coast, the war of attrition between Texas and California is finally nearing its end. Through sheer manpower alone, Texas wins the day, taking California's military bases even under constant naval and aerial attacks. That million-strong armed citizenry proved to be the deciding factor, allowing Texas to create a meat grinder after those citizens had helped the state fend off Florida. California is captured, but Texas lost an enormous amount of people in the process. And worse yet, the Pacific Fleet that it now owns isn't going to be especially effective once it turns its attention to Middle America. The state also knows that Alaska will need to be on its agenda sooner or later. Though Alaska has just 9 military bases and 25,100 personnel, a ground invasion is impossible. Texas or whoever else may attack would have to go through neutral Canada. Still, the newly captured Pacific Fleet will prove extremely useful when the time comes. For now, Texas consolidates as it watches the Midwest burn. Colorado has become a key player in the battle for America's heartland. The state's X factor is its collection of expansive mountain ranges, 15 in total with 54 peaks above 14,000 feet. Those mountains have protected it against Texas so far, though the Lone Star State has been focusing on other states, which means Colorado has had time to send its army on a rampage through the Great Plains. Colorado's power all comes down to the combination of 32,500 Army and Marine soldiers, 15,400 Air Force units, and 2,000 Navy and Coast Guard forces. Kansas is first on the agenda. Though it has a strong army of its own, 29,400 units total, Colorado's superior Air Force makes a huge difference. It allows Colorado to run coordinated attacks on Kansas soldiers, leaving its ground forces free to mop up the scraps. Utah and Wyoming offer little competition either. The latter only has 6,000 military personnel, almost all of whom are in an air force that's less than half the size of Colorado's, allowing the Centennial State to easily dominate on the ground. As for Utah, it faces the same situation. Its 8,700 Army and Marine members can't hold off Colorado, even though its 6,800-strong Air Force provides aerial support. 3 states down in short succession for Colorado. The state then begins to advance northward. Idaho is next up for Colorado, and it again faces the same fate as Utah and Wyoming. An impressive 4,500-strong Air Force makes up the majority of its military forces. Colorado overwhelms that Air Force with one that's 3 times the size, and its army easily mops up the 3,800 people Idaho has on the ground. The only thing slowing Colorado down is the size of the states it's taking. Idaho alone is over 83,000 square miles, making it the 14th largest state by landmass. That's a lot of territory for Colorado's advancing army to cover as it moves on to Montana, another massive state. But again, Colorado benefits from facing a state with practically no ground forces to confront it. Just 2,900 soldiers are in Montana's army, rendering its 4,300-strong Air Force practically moot. With some of the largest Mountain West states taken, Colorado turns its attention to its northeastern borders and Nebraska. The home of the Great Plains and the dissected Till Plains, Nebraska has an average elevation of 2,600 feet, but it's mostly flat land. That would be fine if its 7,100-strong Air Force was larger than that of an invader. That isn't the case with Colorado. The state's Air Force has over twice as many members, and it's supporting a far larger army than Nebraska can offer up. The state puts up a slightly better fight than the ones Colorado has faced so far, but it ends up falling just the same. Again, it's down to a lack of boots on the ground. 4,400 infantrymen can't stand up to 33,000. With that, Colorado has secured its eastern, western, and northern borders, though it still faces a problem with the depleted Texas to the south. It prepares a strike now. Waiting would give Texas a chance to recuperate and pull in people from the states it's already taken. Meanwhile, Virginia is buoyed by no longer having to worry about Florida. That leaves it free to focus on some of the smaller states to its west. Through the taken territory of West Virginia, it attacks Ohio. A fairly simple victory is achieved, as Ohio has 32,000 military personnel. Virginia's aerial might has an edge too, with about 3,000 more units than Ohio's 13,400. With that, Virginia has penned New York into the Northeast, at least in terms of a land invasion. For New York to invade now, it'll have to do so via the Atlantic coast. That particular fact presents a problem for a state that only has 3,700 naval and Coast Guard personnel. But it may not matter. New York finds itself tied up in fighting against Pennsylvania, the state directly to its south. Granted, the battle doesn't last long, as Pennsylvania has nearly half as many military personnel, with 27,700. Still, the battle is enough to weaken New York a little, and it still doesn't have an inroad into Virginia. Worse yet for New York, Virginia is finally taking advantage of its powerful navy. As 51,000 Army and Air Force units move toward Indiana and Michigan, the remaining 96,400-strong Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine units are easily winning the Atlantic Coast battle. New York can't compete. Its 3,700-member Navy and Coast Guard offer little defense to the naval onslaught. Indiana is subsequently obliterated by the invading Virginian army. With just 17,200 military personnel to its name, the state can barely put up much of a fight. Despite almost 45% of its population owning guns, Virginia's army puts an end to any ambitions Indiana might have had of becoming America's strongest state. Michigan suffers the same fate. With a similar-sized force of 15,400, it's still nowhere near strong enough to take on Virginia, resulting in the state dominating almost the entire East Coast, as well as giving it a chance to delve deeper into the center of America. It'll have that chance soon enough as Colorado mounts its attack on Texas. Colorado's plan is to strike quickly after Texas's defeat of California in order to give it an advantage. The Lone Star State lost tens of thousands of its army members, as well as several 100,000 of its armed citizens when taking California. The fatigue from the campaign is at a point where Colorado's 50,000 fighting force could stand a chance. The problem for Colorado becomes apparent, however, as it navigates its own mountainous southern regions. The very mountains that had protected it from Texas also served to protect Texas from Colorado. A rough passage through those mountains leads to Colorado's soldiers being exhausted by the time they engage with Texas. And for the first time, Colorado also finds itself on the losing end of the aerial battle. Having more than 15,000 Air Force personnel may have worked while taking much of the neighboring states, but it doesn't stack up to a Texan Air Force that's around 3 times the size. Colorado's invasion attempts turn out to be folly. It's soon defeated, having barely made it past its own southern mountains. In the meantime, Virginia is left to take on the rest of the American Midwest. Wisconsin falls easily enough, with its 13,300 military personnel being no match for Virginia. The same goes for Maine, with just 4,100 military personnel. However, Virginia faces more of a fight when it confronts Illinois and Iowa. The former has to be taken first, as the latter takes advantage of Illinois lying between it and Virginia's roving army. With 42,500 military personnel, Illinois has a solid chance against the weakening Virginia. The problem is that its navy is stationed at Naval Station Great Lakes. They're guarding waters that Virginia isn't going to use. With that issue, Illinois can do little more than use the navy to conduct missile strikes from the waters onto its own territory. That's not enough to stop Virginia as it takes the state. Iowa is destroyed in no time. 10,900 military personnel are no match for Virginia. All the while, Texas watches and waits. Virginia continues its campaign of destruction. Minnesota soon falls too, with a military presence in the state at just 17,700 personnel. Missouri, on the other hand, represents more of a problem. It has 29,800 personnel, with 21,200 of them being Marines and Army soldiers. They fortify the Mississippi River, which makes up most of the eastern border Virginia needs to penetrate, and force the Virginian armies into an attritional battle. Virginia still comes out on top. It has a strong numbers advantage, but it loses thousands of fighters in the process. Those losses aren't enough to stop South and North Dakota from falling, with their militaries of 7,600 and 11,500 respectively. That finally leaves Virginia one place to go next: Texas. As Virginia prepares to attack, Texas has recuperated and restocked thanks to its strong economy and massive oil reserves. Its Gulf Coast fleet has sailed around Florida and into the Atlantic coast, where it confronts Virginia's navy at Naval Station Norfolk. As for the Texan ground forces, they may have been depleted, but they're still strong enough in numbers to attack Virginia, especially with the state having expended so many of its soldiers in the Midwest. Texas takes Virginia right before the state can launch an attack of its own. All that's left for Texas is to use the Pacific Fleet it captured from California to assault the isolated Alaska. The state puts up a fight, especially with its 11,100 strong Air Force. The rough waters in the Gulf of Alaska also make it difficult for the Pacific Fleet to coordinate attacks. But in the end, that waterborne power is enough, especially when combined with fighter jets and helicopters taking off from the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers. Alaska succumbs. And with that, Texas stands victorious as the strongest state from the United States. Of course, this is just one of many possible scenarios that could happen if America's states turned against one another. Do you think Texas would win? Could another state put up a legitimate challenge to its supremacy? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this video caught your interest, feel free to check out our video on why everyone is afraid of the US military, or this other video you might like. Thanks for watching, and take care out there. What was supposed to be a dream vacation turned into a nightmare. when a group of travelers in Mexico were robbed, murdered, and their bodies thrown into a 50-foot well. And this isn't just a story. It actually happened to an American tourist and his friends in May of 2024, right in the heart of Mexico. And Mexico isn't the only danger zone. From hotspots that make you think, obviously, to unexpected travel traps, these are the 10 most dangerous countries for Americans. Visit them only if you're ready to risk literally everything. Since we've already mentioned Mexico, we'll start there. Now, a question might arise straight away. How can Mexico be one of the top 10 most dangerous countries for Americans to visit when it's so close, so familiar, and often portrayed as paradise for tourists? In 2023 alone, 36.71 million Americans flocked to Mexico to enjoy the crystal-clear turquoise waters of Cancun, see the famous waterfront Mayan ruins in Tulum, and visit Mexico City, a place steeped in history and culture. Well, Mexico is quite a unique entry on our list, primarily shaped by the travel advisory levels set by the US State Department. You see, this country has all 4 advisory levels across different states. The 2 popular tourist destinations we mentioned are in the Quintana Roo state, visited by over 20 million tourists in 2023. Together with Mexico City, a federally administered area, this state falls under Level 2, exercise increased caution when traveling to. This refers to higher than normal levels of disorder or attacks. The Level 2 travel advisory also applies to these 15 other Mexican states. A level above, Level 3, Reconsider Travel to, which suggests travelers may encounter serious risks to their safety. Such things like dense areas of terrorism or gang threats, or may be currently affected by natural disasters. The Level 3 travel advisory has been assigned to the following Mexican states: Baja California, where the incident described in the beginning of this video took place, Chihuahua, Durango, Guanajuato, Jalisco, Morelos, and Sonora. Then there are 6 Mexican states you shouldn't travel to under any circumstances. The states with a Level 4 do not travel warning, which could include life-threatening risks such as nuclear terrorism threats, ongoing rebellions, war, and bombings. These are places where the US government has limited or no ability to help you at all. Level 4 areas in Mexico are as follows: Colima State, Guerrero, Michoacán, Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, and Zacatecas. By contrast, only Campeche and Yucatan states are listed under Level 1, exercise normal precautions. So what is it about Mexico that makes it such a complex tourist destination? Well, you probably already know the answer. Despite its allure, Mexico is plagued by severe cartel violence, homicide, kidnapping, carjacking, robbery. You name a violent crime and it's probably quite widespread and common in Mexico. According to the ACLED Conflict Index, which assesses every territory in the world based on how violent it is, Mexico is by far the most dangerous country for civilians, with more than 30,000 homicides for the 6th consecutive year. And that's on top of the nearly 112,000 people reported missing in 2023. Do the math and you'll realize that's about 60 people going missing every day. Even traveling to a seemingly more secure and popular travel destination like Cancun doesn't guarantee your safety. After all, there are as many as 4 cartels operating in the greater Cancun area: the Sinaloa Cartel, the CJNG, the Gulf Cartel, and the Grupo Regional. That last one among them is primarily made up of former members of the absolutely terrifying Los Zetas. And who are Los Zetas? Only the most vicious cartel in Mexican history, responsible for a number of atrocious massacres, including the second San Fernando massacre, when the members of this cartel killed 193 people over the course of 2 days. So even if you end up in one of the safer Mexican states, it's crucial to stay vigilant and cautious at all times. It might be best to follow the guidelines the U.S. State Department outlines for the government employees. Avoid traveling between cities after dark, avoid hailing a taxi on the street, exercise increased caution when visiting local bars, nightclubs, and casinos, be extra vigilant when visiting banks and ATMs, and avoid displaying any signs of wealth, including expensive jewelry and watches. Or play it safe and find another travel destination entirely, because Mexico is probably the best of the worst. Things are more grim and gruesome from here. So let's take our precarious trip to our next country, Haiti. Now, if you don't follow the news, this might be a somewhat shocking revelation, as Haiti is also a beloved destination for American tourists. After all, what's not to love? The Caribbean beaches, the vibrant culture, the rich history. Well, we're sure the more than 230 U.S. citizens who had to be airlifted out of Haiti amid a gang-led rebellion in March of 2024 could add quite a few items to the What's Not to Like About Haiti list. Let's break this list down. The U.S. State Department advises American citizens not to travel to Haiti for three main reasons: civil unrest, violent crime, and a poor healthcare system. Worst of all, the situation in Haiti is becoming more alarming each passing year. From 2021 to 2023 alone, the number of identified gangs operating in the country nearly doubled. That's why it also shouldn't be surprising that the violence involving these gangs increased by 60% in the same period. By violence, we're primarily referring to armed confrontations, assaults, and kidnappings. In the first half of 2024, there have already been 166 separate events of these kinds, resulting in more than 1,500 civilian fatalities. American citizens in particular most commonly fall victim to kidnapping for ransom. The worst part, these tourists often barely get a chance to set foot on Haitian soil before getting violently attacked. The robbers often linger around the Toussaint-Louverture International Airport, waiting for foreigners to arrive. Once they spot them, they follow their cars and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike, often severely injuring the tourists in the process. Now, you might think that traveling in a larger group will keep you safe, but we've got bad news. Even larger groups aren't immune. In fact, they might even be more appealing to these criminals. Why? Well, it's simple math. The more tourists, the higher the ransom. That's why the notorious Haitian gang 400 Mawoso, the largest in the country, had no issues kidnapping 17 people from a tourist bus back in 2022 just outside the country's capital, Port-au-Prince. A year prior, 17 Christian missionaries from the US and Canada were kidnapped by the same gang, who demanded $1 million for their release. $1 million each. And if the gangs don't get you, the Haitian police just might. Political violence has been plaguing Haiti for years, with dozens of events taking place in the country every month. In March of 2024 alone, there were almost 100 clashes with law enforcement, 29 of which involved brutal violence against civilians. So that's civil unrest and violent crime, but what about the third reason, poor healthcare? Well, as if everything we've told you so far wasn't enough, Haiti is also still reeling from the first modern large-scale outbreak of cholera, a disease that was supposed to be beaten ages ago. Between October of 2022 and April of 2023, when a resurgence of cholera was reported, as many as 82,885 people were suspected to have contracted the disease by the Haitian Ministry of Public Health and Population. A little over 80,000 of them were hospitalized, while 1,270 perished. But while gangs present a continuing threat, at least the Haitian government as a whole doesn't have it out for you. That same terrifying notion can't be said for our next country. Afghanistan's perilous landscape makes every moment a gamble with your life. Let's get ahead of a seemingly obvious question. Who would want to visit Afghanistan, given its tumultuous history with the US? Well, there is such a thing as danger tourism, with travelers who are drawn to Afghanistan's rugged landscapes, rich cultural heritage, and the desire to experience this complex history firsthand. As a UK traveler puts it, it's just raw. You don't get much rawer than there. That can be attractive if you want to see real life. It seems that quite a few people share this sentiment, as the number of foreign tourists actually rose by 120% in 2023, reaching nearly 5,200. But let's be clear, you shouldn't be part of this statistic in 2024, or any year after. Why? Take your pick. There's terrorism, with dozens of major terrorist groups operating within the country. According to many, the country is even run by a terrorist organization, the Taliban. And let us tell you, the Taliban officials might say they support tourism, but their promises and appeals are nothing more than a veneer over a regime notorious for its brutal repression, violence, and a pervasive threat to any foreign presence. So what can happen to you as a foreigner in Afghanistan? For one, you can get wrongfully detained for allegedly violating the Taliban laws like a group of foreign citizens was in March of 2024, with 2 Americans included. While in detention, you would have limited or no access to medical attention and might even be subjected to physical abuse. The worst part? The US government won't be able to do much for you since the Taliban don't allow welfare checks for American nationals, including by phone. So you'll be detained, not knowing why, not knowing for how long, and entirely at the mercy of a regime with no regard for your well-being. Sounds like a dream vacation, right? If this isn't enough to make your hair stand on end, the crime statistics in Afghanistan might just do the trick. For every 100,000 people in the country, over 76 crimes have been committed in 2024. That's a crime rate that places Afghanistan in the top 4 most dangerous countries in the world, according to the Economic Times, only behind South Sudan, Sudan, and number 1, Yemen. Yemen has also made it on our list, with a truly alarming track record of chaos and despair, but more on that later. For now, let's discuss which of the many crimes plaguing Afghanistan might affect you the most. If you've been carefully listening to the video so far, you probably already know the answer. That's right, kidnapping. Since 2021, when the US Embassy in Kabul suspended operations, the Taliban have pretty much been back in the hostage business. Foreign nationals are prime targets, with the Taliban using kidnappings for ransom or political leverage. I know it's sounding pretty bad so far, but it's about to get worse. Way worse. Back in the Americas, another US tourist trap is waiting, ready to spring. In Venezuela, you'll find nothing but trouble. Human rights abuses, lack of proper healthcare, civil unrest, wrongful detention. These are just some of the threats you can encounter in what the World Population Review has deemed the highest crime-ridden country, with a crime index rating of 82.1. Given how high this rate is, it shouldn't be surprising that the selection of crimes committed in Venezuela on the daily run the gamut. Homicide, armed robbery, kidnapping, carjacking, and the list could go on and on. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that as many as 98% of these crimes don't result in prosecution. So if you're fond of justice, accountability, and safety, Venezuela might just be your worst nightmare. However, out of all the threats that should stop you from visiting Venezuela, civil unrest is undoubtedly number 1 at the moment. After Nicolas Maduro, a long-term president of Venezuela, won his 3rd consecutive 6-year term under highly suspicious circumstances in July of 2024, chaos has once again erupted in the country. 1/3 of all the 140 post-election demonstrations were marred with violence, with at least 25 people having been killed so far, nearly 200 injured, and more than 2,400 arrested. Not to mention, the continued crisis has fueled fears that the Venezuelan authorities could launch a wider crackdown on opposition leaders and protesters. From this figure alone, it's obvious that the country's security forces have no issue responding with lethal violence after exhausting methods like tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets. But let's say you stay away from the states like Carabobo and Miranda, where most of the demonstrations are taking place. Will you then be able to enjoy the many stunning beaches or the rich cultural sites Venezuela has to offer? Sadly, no. Even in the so-called safer areas, crime is pervasive. Those beautiful beaches, they're not free from the reach of armed robbers or opportunistic kidnappers. That vibrant nightlife, it's often overshadowed by the looming threat of violence. No matter how far you try to escape from the chaos, Venezuela's instability follows. And even if you briefly escape it, you'll likely miss something else: gasoline, electricity, water, or medicine, as shortages of these vital resources are common throughout the country. The same and even more can be said for the next country on our list, Yemen. Now, although Yemen is overflowing with centuries-old traditions, breathtaking landscapes, and ancient ruins, it probably won't make it onto your must-see travel list. And let us tell you why traveling to this nation could be a harrowing experience. The US hasn't had an operating embassy in Yemen since 2015. In other words, whatever happens to you as a tourist in the country, you'll be left to your own devices. So what can actually happen to you? Quite a lot, actually. Out of the 9 risk factors that the US State Department uses to determine how safe a country is for travel, as many as 6 are present in Yemen. The factors in question are terrorism, civil unrest, health risks, kidnapping, armed conflict, and landmines. You'll probably notice the last factor, landmines, is new to our list, adding a whole new layer of danger to an already catastrophic situation. The landmines are laid by the Houthi forces, the armed Islamist group that controls most of the country. According to the Landmine Monitor, at least 582 people were killed or wounded by these landmines in 2022, most of them civilians. Now, if the prospect of having to watch every step for hidden explosives doesn't make you think twice, the rest of the dreary stats on Yemen might. Yemen is currently ranked at 23rd in the world on the Global Terrorism Index. This makes it one of the places on the planet with the most terrorist activity. The ACLED Conflict Index paints an even worse picture, ranking Yemen as the 13th most dangerous country in the world. Besides terrorist activities, such a high ranking mostly has to do with frequent political violence events, numerous abductions and forced disappearances, and the geographic diffusion of the conflict. Thanks to the last factor, as many as 4 million people are exposed to conflict in the country, which is about 12% of Yemen's population. The 5 most exposed provinces are as follows: Al-Jof, Taiz, Al-Hudaydah, containing the port that Israel shelled recently, Amanat al-Asima, and Aden. Look at a map of Yemen showing all the provinces and you'll realize there's barely a corner of this country untouched by chaos. And as far as most people are concerned, chaos and a nice vacation aren't exactly a match made in heaven. Chaos also reigns supreme in Burkina Faso, which is a less often discussed danger zone on the world stage. Well, chaos and death reign supreme. In 2023 alone, as many as 8,500 lost their lives in Burkina Faso as a result of clashes between the country's security forces and rebels. These clashes, together with violence linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State terrorist organizations, also led to the displacement of over 2 million people. Another 150,000 fled across borders, seeking refuge from a nation consumed by relentless bloodshed. And visiting a country tens of thousands of people are desperately fleeing isn't exactly one you want to go into. If you do dare, however, the US State Department warns you of 3 major threats: terrorism, crime, and kidnapping. Across all 3 threats, one thing rings true: you're truly safe nowhere. Not your hotel, not restaurants, not places of worship, not even police stations, customs offices, or military posts. Terrorists can and will strike anywhere. If we're talking about specific regions, the most alarming situation is in the East and Sahel regions. the Kosi and Suru provinces in the Bukal-Demuun region, the Kenadugu province in the Obasan region, the Lurum province in the north region, and the Kupelago province in the center-east region, where the government of Burkina Faso maintains a state of emergency. Of course, for tourists, kidnapping remains the most pervasive threat across these regions and the entirety of Burkina Faso. In May of 2019, a hostage rescue operation was launched to free 4 international hostages who had been kidnapped in the country and neighboring Benin. Among them was an American woman in her 60s who had been kept captive for a grueling 28 days. Perhaps a sliver of hope, as a similar fate is unlikely to befall the travelers to the next country on our list, Myanmar, as kidnapping isn't mentioned as one of the widespread threats in the country. But don't let this fool you. Myanmar is still an incredibly violent country. In fact, it's the second most violent region in the world, according to the ACLED Conflict Index, behind only Palestine. This unflattering title primarily stems from the highest number of non-state armed groups ravaging the country, over 1,500 of them. The worst part? They're everywhere. In the cities, in the forests, in rural villages. So whether you're trekking through the country's once famous natural landscapes or exploring the remains of its urban centers, you could be walking straight into a battlefield. After all, battles are the single most common instances of political violence in the country. In June 2024, there were 288 of them, which is the lowest number reported in 2024. The highest was from March, with as many as 385 battles taking place across the country. The states hit the hardest by this violence include Rakhine, Zagaing, and Northern Shan. In total, as many as 43% of the Myanmar population, which is roughly 22.8 million people, are exposed to conflict in the country. So, what are the chances that you as a traveler will avoid it? None. That's what. As a traveler in Myanmar, you stand little chance of staying clear of the pervasive conflict that engulfs the nation. With nearly half of the population living in areas plagued by violence, your odds of encountering a clash or skirmish are alarmingly high. The tumultuous landscape is not just a backdrop, but an ever-present risk, making Myanmar one of the most perilous destinations you could choose. A destination where 15,800 people lost their lives in 2023 alone, the highest conflict-rated toll after Ukraine and Israel. Think about it for a second. You might not hear about the situation in Myanmar as much as you do about the Russo-Ukrainian and Israel-Hamas wars, but this figure alone should tell you everything you need to know. Now, let's be honest. The last few countries we've mentioned aren't particularly appealing to most travelers, especially when compared to Mexico. As for the next country on our list, it might be a little more divisive. How so? Well, some US citizens won't need any reports and statistics to stay far away from it. Others will have a harder time, as this is undoubtedly one of the most unique countries in the world, making it an alluring mystery. The country in question is North Korea. Now, no violent clashes, crimes, or civil unrest placed this country on the do not travel list. The reason why traveling to North Korea isn't recommended, and that's the understatement of the century, is the continuing serious risk of arrest and long-term detention of US nationals. In fact, this risk is so alarmingly high that your passport actually isn't valid to travel to, in, or through North Korea without special validation, which is only reserved for national interests. Even with these measures in place, there have been US citizens who traveled to North Korea, either fueled by intense religious zeal or enticed by the cryptic allure of a highly isolated authoritarian state. Whatever the reason, their visits almost never ended well. Kenneth Bae, a tourist guide and a Korean-American missionary, was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 2012 for, quote, hostile acts. But he was fortunately rescued after 2 years. Matthew Miller, who wanted to seek political asylum in the country in 2014, was sentenced to 6 years of hard labor under spying accusations. However, Otto Warmbier, a 22-year-old student at the time, had it the worst. He was seized from a tour group in 2016 and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor for allegedly trying to steal a propaganda poster. A poster. And that's not even the worst part. After 17 months of captivity in North Korea, Warmbier was flown home in a vegetative state, where he soon died. These 3 cases alone are enough to make one thing loud and clear. Traveling to North Korea from the US isn't worth it under any circumstances. For the last 2 countries on our list, we'll travel to Europe for the first time. Now, this might be odd, as Europe is often seen as a relatively safe and stable region compared to the turmoil of other continents. And it was, until February 24th, 2022. However, Ukraine isn't one of the 2 remaining countries on our list, as avoiding traveling to a country caught up in a highly publicized and brutal war is a given. That same reason is also why Palestine isn't on this list. But the 2 countries that did make the list are still connected to the Ukraine conflict. They just stand on the opposite side of the battlefield. The first of which is Belarus. Since the war in Ukraine started, Belarus has been closely aligned with Russia, to the point of serving as a staging point for the war. So the only thing you can find in Belarus is numerous Russian military forces looking for the best way to inflict more damage on Ukraine. If recent reports are to be trusted, you can also find nuclear weapons stored in the country, as Russia has allegedly started placing them in Belarus as part of its strategic military positioning. Not the company you want to find yourself in. However, even if you take Ukraine and Russia out of the equation, Belarus isn't exactly a prime traveling destination on its own. The country remains under a repressive regime, with human rights abuses and political oppression prevalent. The government, led by President Alexander Lukashenko, has been heavily criticized for its crackdown on dissent, suppression of free speech, and general lack of political freedoms. Tens of thousands of individuals, US citizens included, have already been detained in recent years for these very reasons. Travel to Belarus as a US citizen, and you just might find yourself on the receiving end of the regime's harsh measures against perceived dissent and foreign influence. Measures that are handed out pretty arbitrarily. Worst of all, the US Embassy in Minsk halted operations in February of 2022. So if you do, you'll be virtually on your own. Speaking of being all alone in this world, we've finally reached the last country on our list: Russia. The fact that Russia considers the US its #1 enemy and actively rebels against what it perceives as a US-led world order is reason enough for most US travelers to feel uneasy in this country. But hey, we get it. There's the awe-inspiring St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, renowned for its fairy tale-like architecture. Then there's the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, one of the largest and most prestigious art museums in the world, with a truly impressive collection of art and artifacts. For the adventurers, there's Lake Baikal, often referred to as the Pearl of Siberia, which offers breathtaking views and a serene escape into one of the world's deepest and oldest freshwater lakes. But for all the beauty Russia has to offer, there's even more ugliness. Due to the ongoing geopolitical tensions and internal instability, US citizens in Russia may face harassment and wrongful detention by authorities. Recent reports have detailed incidents of arbitrary enforcement of local laws and denial of consular access to detained individuals. And as of July 2024, there are at least a dozen US citizens held in Russian jails or prisons under these circumstances. Their charges range from drug possessions and theft to treason and espionage. Luckily, some of them were released in the historic prisoner swap between Russia and the West in August of 2024. But this in no way alleviates the ongoing risks and uncertainties for US travelers in the country. Simply put, every measure that the Russian government introduces makes one thing abundantly clear: it sees all Americans as enemies. That's why it suspended all consular operations outside Moscow, severely limiting the US government's ability to assist its citizens. Additionally, US credit and debit cards no longer work in Russia due to sanctions, and even commercial flight options are limited. And let's not forget about the looming terrorist threat. Since the coordinated terrorist attack in March of 2024 against civilians at the Crocus City Hall music venue in the Moscow Oblast, which killed 145 people and injured another 551, the danger to civilians remains high. As the Moscow attack has proven, these attacks can take place virtually anywhere, in markets, transport hubs, and other bustling tourist areas. So, for your safety, and due to all the reasons mentioned above, it's better to stay away from Russia altogether. But be advised, this list is in no way exhaustive. In fact, there are 11 more countries with the bone-chilling Level 4 Do Not Travel designation by the US State Department. Iran, Bangladesh, Libya, Lebanon, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, Mali, Central African Republic, Ukraine, and Sudan. In total, that's roughly 10% of the countries in the world. There are even countries with lower travel advisory levels, such as Colombia, with a Level 3 Reconsider Travel Advisory, that are still fraught with risk for American tourists. Believe it or not, in 2024 alone, there has been one death every 6 days in the Colombian city of Medellin, dubbed the second coolest city in the world by Forbes magazine in 2023. So, needless to say, no matter where you go, stay diligent and be alert. If this video caught your interest, feel free to check out our video on the tiny country that destroyed its gangs, or this other video you might like. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care out there.